The story of English ethnicity represents one of the most complex and layered narratives of human population, movement, genetic admixture, and cultural transformation in European history. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Phone face down, volume at a whisper. Let's dive in. The geological transformation that created the geographical foundation for what would eventually become England began during the final phases of the last glacial maximum, a period extending from approximately 26,000 to 19,000 years before present, when massive ice sheets, covering most of the British Isles, began their gradual retreat northward. This retreat occurred not as a steady, linear process, but through a series of advances and withdrawals that reflected fluctuating global temperatures and atmospheric conditions, creating a dynamic landscape where glacial margins shifted across hundreds of miles over the course of millennia. The ice sheets, at their maximum extent, had reached as far south as the Thames Valley, grinding down mountainous terrain into the rolling topography that would characterize much of northern England, while depositing vast quantities of glacial till that would eventually provide the foundation for fertile agricultural soils. The weight of these ice masses, in some locations exceeding 2 kilometers in thickness, had depressed the underlying bedrock by several hundred meters, a geological phenomenon known as isostatic depression that would continue to influence British topography through a process of rebound that persists into the present era. The meltwater released by glacial retreat created enormous proglacial lakes and transformed river systems throughout the region, with volumes of water far exceeding anything witnessed in recorded history, flowing through valleys and carving channels that would define watershed boundaries for subsequent human populations. The English Channel during this period did not exist as a marine barrier, but rather formed part of a broader landmass connecting Britain directly to continental Europe, a region known to modern researchers as Doggerland, that encompassed approximately 18,000 square kilometers of territory, now submerged beneath the North Sea. The environmental conditions prevailing across this landscape during the terminal Pleistocene created an ecosystem fundamentally different from anything familiar to historical populations, with vast areas of tundra and cold steppe supporting megafaunal species, including woolly mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, steppe bison, wild horses, and reindeer that provided sustenance for sparse human populations. The vegetation consisted primarily of hardy, cold-adapted plant species, including dwarf, birch, willow, various grasses, and sedges that could tolerate the brief growing seasons and permafrost conditions, characteristic of periglacial environments, creating a landscape that would have appeared simultaneously desolate and teeming with life to modern observers. Archaeological evidence from sites like Paviland Cave in Wales, where human remains dating to approximately 31,000 years before present have been discovered, demonstrates that anatomically modern humans had established a presence in the region well before the last glacial maximum, though the subsequent advance of ice sheets likely rendered most of Britain uninhabitable and forced any resident populations to retreat southward into ice-free refugia in what is now France and Iberia. The genetic legacy of these earliest populations remains difficult to trace with certainty, as the extreme population bottlenecks and subsequent demographic expansions associated with glacial cycles created complex patterns of genetic drift and replacement that obscure the direct ancestral relationships between Paleolithic inhabitants and later populations. The archaeological record from the period between 15,000 and 10,000 years before present reveals increasing evidence of human reoccupation as environmental conditions improved, with characteristic stone tool assemblages indicating the presence of mobile hunter-gatherer groups exploiting the expanding resources available in the gradually warming landscape. The Mesolithic period, extending from approximately 10,000 to 6,000 years before present, witnessed the establishment of the first substantial post-glacial human populations in what would become England, representing groups whose subsistence strategies, social organizations, and genetic compositions would provide the foundational layer upon which all subsequent populations would build. These Mesolithic inhabitants, arriving from continental European source populations as the ice sheets retreated and environmental conditions permitted sustained human occupation, brought with them sophisticated technological traditions adapted to the mixed woodland and riverine environments that were replacing the tundra landscapes of the terminal Pleistocene. The toolkit assemblages, characteristic of British Mesolithic populations, featured microliths, small geometric stone tools that were hafted in composite arrangements to create specialized implements for hunting, fishing, and plant processing, demonstrating an adaptive flexibility that enabled exploitation of diverse ecological niches across varying environmental zones. The populations responsible for these assemblages were not static or homogeneous, but rather represented dynamic groups that maintained long-distance connections with continental populations while developing distinctive regional traditions that reflected adaptations to local environmental conditions and resource availability. Genetic evidence derived from ancient DNA extracted from Mesolithic skeletal remains, including the famous Cheddar Man specimen from Gough's Cave in Somerset, dated to approximately 9,100 years before present, reveals that these populations possess genetic characteristics substantially different from modern English populations, with dark skin pigmentation, blue or green eyes, and genetic affinities, linking them most closely to populations from the Iberian Peninsula and Western Mediterranean regions, rather than to later arriving groups from Central or Northern Europe. The Mesolithic inhabitants of Britain developed subsistence strategies that exploited both terrestrial and aquatic resources with remarkable efficiency, establishing seasonal settlement patterns that enabled them to maximize caloric returns from the diverse ecosystems available across the landscape. Coastal populations developed sophisticated marine exploitation strategies, harvesting shellfish, fish, and marine mammals that provided reliable protein sources throughout the year, with shell-midden deposits at sites like Moreton in eastern Scotland, documenting intensive use of coastal resources over extended periods spanning multiple generations. Riverine environments provided access to migratory fish species, particularly salmon and eels, whose predictable seasonal movements enabled planning and coordination of group activities around anticipated resource pulses, while also supporting diverse waterfowl and aquatic plant species that supplemented dietary intake. The woodland environments that expanded across most of lowland Britain during the early Holocene supported populations of red deer, roe deer, wild boar, and aurochs that provided large packages of meat and other valuable materials, including hides, sinew, and bones suitable for tool manufacture, with hunting strategies likely involving both individual stalking and coordinated group drives that channeled animals into advantageous positions for dispatch. Plant resources, while archaeologically less visible than animal remains, almost certainly contributed substantially to Mesolithic diets, with hazelnuts representing a particularly important storable resource that could bridge seasonal gaps in other food availability, while various roots, tubers, and leafy greens provided essential nutrients and dietary diversity. The settlement patterns discernible through archaeological investigation reveal a high degree of mobility, with most sites representing temporary occupations lasting from days to months rather than permanent year-round habitations, though certain locations with exceptional resource availability or strategic importance witnessed repeated reoccupation over centuries, resulting in the accumulation of dense archaeological deposits that provide windows into the lives of these earliest English inhabitants. The social organization of Mesolithic populations remains difficult to reconstruct with precision given the limitations of the archaeological record, but evidence from settlement patterns, burial practices, and comparative ethnographic studies of recent hunter-gatherer societies suggests systems based on relatively egalitarian small group organization, with leadership roles based primarily on demonstrated competence and personal charisma rather than inherited status or institutionalized authority. The population density throughout Britain during the Mesolithic period remained extremely low by later standards, with demographic models suggesting total populations possibly not exceeding several thousand individuals distributed across the entire landmass, creating social landscapes where face-to-face interactions with non-kin groups likely occurred infrequently, and where maintenance of social networks across dispersed populations required deliberate effort and periodic aggregation at favorable locations. Burial practices during this period provide some of the clearest evidence for social differentiation and ritual behavior, with certain individuals receiving special treatment that suggests recognition of particular social status or ritual significance, though the overall pattern remains one of relatively modest differentiation compared to later periods. The burial at Gough's Cave that yielded the Cheddarman remains occurred within a context of apparent ritual activity that included the processing of human remains in ways suggesting complex mortuary practices possibly involving defleshing, though whether this reflected ancestor veneration, cannibalism, or other ritual purposes remains subject to scholarly debate. The symbolic and cognitive world of Mesolithic populations left remarkably few material traces in the British archaeological record compared to contemporary continental populations, with representational art remaining extremely rare and primarily consisting of geometric engravings on portable objects, rather than the elaborate cave paintings or sculptural traditions documented elsewhere in Europe, perhaps reflecting differences in ritual practices, preservation conditions, or the specific locations chosen for symbolic expression. The catastrophic flooding that separated Britain from continental Europe approximately 8,200 years before present, caused by the collapse of glacial meltwater lakes and possibly accelerated by submarine landslides, such as the Storegga Slide off the coast of Norway, transformed the human geography of the region by creating the English Channel and severing the direct land connections that had enabled free movement between Britain and the continent. This marine inundation, which proceeded relatively rapidly on geological timescales, though likely occurring over several human generations, submerged vast areas of Doggerland that had supported Mesolithic populations, forcing displacement and likely causing substantial population losses as productive lowland areas disappeared beneath rising waters. The creation of this marine barrier did not immediately end all contact between British and continental populations, as watercraft technology had certainly developed to levels permitting coastal navigation and sea crossings even before the final inundation, with archaeological evidence of marine resource exploitation and the presence of exotic raw materials at British sites, demonstrating the existence of maritime capabilities. However, the transformation of Britain into an island unquestionably altered the frequency and character of population contacts, reducing the ease with which people, ideas, and technologies could move between Britain and the continent, while creating conditions that would permit the development of increasingly distinctive insular traditions. The genetic effects of this insularization remain somewhat ambiguous, as the subsequent arrival of Neolithic populations, bearing agricultural technologies, would introduce substantial new genetic material that would obscure the effects of any Mesolithic population isolation. But the creation of geographical barriers likely did contribute to the development of regional genetic and cultural differentiation during the late Mesolithic period. The Neolithic Revolution, representing one of the most profound transformations in human history, reached Britain approximately 6,000 years before present, when populations bearing agricultural technologies, domesticated animals, and new material culture traditions began arriving from continental sources, initiating processes of demographic and genetic change that would fundamentally alter the composition of British populations. The transition to agriculture in Britain occurred not through the gradual adoption of farming practices by existing Mesolithic hunter-gatherer populations, but rather primarily through the arrival and demographic expansion of farming populations who brought with them complete agricultural packages, including domesticated wheat, barley, cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs, along with the knowledge and social structures necessary for successful agricultural subsistence. This pattern of population replacement, rather than cultural transmission, has been conclusively demonstrated through ancient DNA studies that reveal dramatic genetic discontinuity between Mesolithic and Neolithic populations in Britain, with the incoming farmers showing genetic affinities to Neolithic populations from Anatolia and the Near East, who had developed agricultural systems in those regions thousands of years earlier, before expanding westward across Europe. The genetic transformation was profound, with studies suggesting that incoming Neolithic populations contributed approximately 90% of the ancestry of British populations during the early Neolithic period, indicating that the indigenous Mesolithic inhabitants either underwent catastrophic population decline, were substantially replaced through demographic competition, or were absorbed through intermarriage that resulted in the overwhelming predominance of farmer genetic contributions in subsequent generations. The archaeological record documents the appearance of Neolithic material culture across Britain in ways that suggest relatively rapid adoption of farming lifestyles once agricultural populations began establishing themselves in the region, with radiocarbon dates clustering around 4000 BC in southern England and spreading northward and westward over the subsequent centuries. The earliest Neolithic sites in Britain feature rectangular timber longhouses similar to those found in continental Neolithic contexts, suggesting that the initial farming populations attempted to replicate familiar settlement patterns from their continental homelands before adapting to insular conditions and developing distinctively British Neolithic architectural traditions. The economic foundation of these early farming communities rested on mixed agriculture, combining cereal cultivation with animal husbandry, creating subsistence systems that required substantially different land management strategies than those employed by Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, including forest clearance to create agricultural fields and pastures, investment in permanent settlements and field systems, and storage of agricultural surpluses to buffer against seasonal and annual variations in productivity. The environmental impacts of these new land use patterns prove substantial and irreversible, with pollen records documenting dramatic declines in tree species and corresponding increases in grasses and other open country plants as Neolithic populations cleared forests and maintained agricultural landscapes through repeated burning and grazing, fundamentally transforming the ecological character of the British Isles in ways that persist into the present era. The social organization of Neolithic populations differed fundamentally from that of their Mesolithic predecessors, with agricultural subsistence enabling and requiring more sedentary settlement patterns, larger population aggregations, investment in fixed infrastructure including houses and field boundaries, and social institutions capable of coordinating labor for agricultural activities and monumental construction projects. The most visible manifestation of these organizational capacities appears in the megalithic monuments that Neolithic populations constructed across Britain, including chambered tombs, causewayed enclosures, henges, and eventually the great stone circles that remain among the most iconic features of the British landscape. These monuments, requiring the mobilization of substantial labor forces and representing investments of thousands of person-hours in their construction, demonstrate both the existence of social mechanisms capable of organizing collective action and the importance of ritual and symbolic practices in Neolithic societies. The chambered tombs that appeared during the early Neolithic period, exemplified by sites like Wayland Smithy in Oxfordshire and West Kennet Long Barrow in Wiltshire, served as communal burial facilities where the remains of multiple individuals were deposited over extended periods, creating repositories of ancestral bones that likely played important roles in legitimating territorial claims and maintaining social cohesion through connections to deceased predecessors. The construction and use of these monuments suggests societies in which collective identity and group affiliation held particular importance, with the communal nature of burial practices contrasting with the more individualized treatments that would characterize later Bronze Age mortuary traditions. The causewayed enclosures that appeared during the Middle Neolithic period, characterized by discontinuous ditches and banks surrounding areas ranging from 1 to several hectares, represent another category of monument whose functions remain subject to scholarly debate, but likely included roles as gathering places for dispersed communities, venues for ritual activities, locations for exchange and social interaction, and possibly defensive installations during periods of conflict. These sites, distributed widely across southern and eastern England, with concentrations in areas like the Sussex Downs and the Thames Valley, suggest the existence of social networks spanning considerable distances and the importance of periodic aggregation events that brought together populations normally resident in dispersed farmsteads or small settlements. The material culture recovered from causewayed enclosures includes substantial quantities of pottery, stone tools, animal bones, representing feasting activities, and occasional evidence of human remains that may indicate violence or ritual practices, painting pictures of complex social events that combined economic, social, and ritual functions. The labor investments represented by these monuments, while substantial, generally fell short of those required for the great stone circles that would characterize the later Neolithic period, suggesting gradually increasing organizational capacities and perhaps evolving social structures that enabled mobilization of larger labor forces for more ambitious construction projects. The appearance of the first stone circles during the late Neolithic period, with construction at sites like Stonehenge beginning around 3100 BC, marks another phase in the development of monument building traditions and social organization in Neolithic Britain. These structures, particularly in their later elaborations involving the transport and erection of massive sarsen stones and carefully shaped bluestones brought from Wales, represent engineering achievements that required sophisticated technical knowledge, careful planning, coordination of large labor forces over extended periods, and social systems capable of commanding the resources necessary for such ambitious projects. The astronomical alignments evident in the layout of these monuments, particularly the famous Midsummer Sunrise alignment at Stonehenge, demonstrate sophisticated observational knowledge of celestial phenomena and suggest that these structures served functions related to tracking seasonal cycles, coordinating agricultural activities, and perhaps integrating cosmological beliefs with practical time-reckoning needs. The construction of Stonehenge occurred in multiple phases, extending over more than a millennium, with the earliest phase consisting of a simple circular earthwork and timber structure erected around 3100 BC, followed by the addition of the bluestones around 2900 BC, and the final arrangement of massive sarsen stones in the familiar formation around 2500 BC, demonstrating both the enduring significance of this location and the evolving architectural ambitions of the populations responsible for its construction. The genetic composition of British populations during the Neolithic period remained relatively stable, following the initial population replacement associated with the arrival of farming groups, with ancient DNA evidence suggesting that the descendants of these Neolithic farmers continued to predominate in the genetic makeup of British populations for over 2,000 years. However, this genetic continuity did not imply static populations or the absence of continued interactions with continental groups, as the appearance of new material culture, traditions, architectural styles, and burial practices throughout the Neolithic period clearly indicates ongoing contacts and cultural exchanges that introduced new ideas and practices, even if they did not substantially alter the genetic composition of British populations. The evidence for long-distance exchange networks during the Neolithic period includes the distribution of exotic materials, like the bluestone from Preseli Hills in Wales, that was transported to Stonehenge, the movement of high-quality flint from specialised extraction sites like Grimes Graves in Norfolk that was distributed widely across Britain, and the appearance of continental artefact styles at British sites that demonstrate awareness of and connection to broader European cultural developments. These exchange networks likely operated through down-the-line trading relationships where materials passed through multiple hands rather than through direct long-distance expeditions, though the transport of the Stonehenge bluestones clearly required organised long-distance movement that may have involved watercraft and coordinated efforts by multiple communities along the transport route. The late Neolithic period witnessed the development of increasingly elaborate material culture traditions, including the appearance of grooved ware pottery, featuring complex geometric decorations that differed substantially from the earlier, plain bowl traditions. The construction of massive timber circles, like those at Durrington Walls near Stonehenge, that may have served as gathering places for the communities involved in monument construction, and changes in burial practices that saw declining use of communal chambered tombs in favour of individual burials that would become characteristic of the subsequent Bronze Age. These transformations suggest evolving social structures and ideological systems, with some scholars arguing for increasing social differentiation and the emergence of more hierarchical organizations capable of mobilizing the substantial resources evident in the great monument building projects of this period. The demographic scale of late Neolithic populations remains difficult to estimate with precision, but the density and distribution of archaeological sites suggests populations numbering in the tens of thousands distributed across Britain, representing a dramatic increase from the sparse Mesolithic populations, but still maintaining population densities far below those that would characterize later periods. The health and nutritional status of Neolithic populations, as reconstructed from skeletal remains, generally appears to have been reasonably good, despite the transition to agricultural diets that in some regions resulted in nutritional deficiencies and health problems associated with over-reliance on cereals, suggesting that British Neolithic populations maintained diverse diets, incorporating both agricultural products and continued exploitation of wild resources, including fish, game, and gathered plant foods. The arrival of beaker culture populations in Britain around 2500 BC initiated another period of dramatic genetic and cultural transformation that would mark the transition from the Neolithic to the Bronze Age, result in population replacements comparable in scale to those that had accompanied the initial arrival of farming populations over 3,000 years earlier. The beaker phenomenon, named for the distinctive bell-shaped pottery vessels that serve as the most recognizable archaeological marker of these populations, originated in the Iberian Peninsula and spread across Western and Central Europe during the 3rd millennium BC, through processes that clearly involved substantial population movements, rather than merely the diffusion of cultural practices. The genetic evidence from ancient DNA studies demonstrates that beaker-associated populations arriving in Britain carried ancestry derived from steppe populations of Eastern Europe and Western Asia, specifically showing genetic continuities with the Yamnaya culture and related groups who had developed pastoral economies on the Pontic-Caspian steppe and had expanded westward across Europe during the 3rd millennium BC, bringing with them not only distinctive genetic markers, but also technological innovations, including wheeled vehicles, horseback riding, and eventually metallurgical knowledge that would transform European societies. The genetic impact of beaker-associated migration into Britain proved profound and remarkably complete, with ancient DNA evidence indicating that within a few centuries of their arrival, beaker-associated ancestry had come to comprise approximately 90% of the genetic makeup of British populations, mirroring the scale of replacement that had accompanied the earlier Neolithic transition and raising profound questions about the mechanisms and consequences of this demographic transformation. The factors driving this dramatic population replacement remain subjects of active scholarly investigation and debate, with proposed explanations ranging from violent conquest and displacement of existing populations to epidemic diseases that disproportionately affected Neolithic populations while sparing incoming groups, to demographic advantages associated with beaker subsistence strategies and social organizations that enabled their populations to expand more rapidly than resident farming communities. The archaeological record provides limited clear evidence for widespread violence during this transition period, though the inherent difficulties in detecting conflict through archaeological means and the existence of some sites with evidence of trauma and destruction leave open the possibility that violence played some role in the population replacement process. The alternative hypothesis, emphasizing disease as a primary mechanism, gains some support from genetic evidence, indicating that beaker-associated populations carried different pathogen resistances than Neolithic populations, potentially including immunity to plague and other epidemic diseases that may have swept through dense Neolithic farming populations while sparing incoming groups, though direct evidence for specific pathogens remains elusive, and this explanation remains somewhat speculative. The demographic competition model, which emphasizes the cumulative effects of small differences in birth rates, death rates, and population growth over multiple generations, provides a mechanism that could produce dramatic population replacements without requiring single catastrophic events, particularly if beaker-associated populations possessed subsistence strategies, social organizations, or technological advantages that enabled them to achieve higher reproductive success than resident Neolithic communities. The material culture and subsistence practices associated with beaker populations demonstrate both continuities with earlier Neolithic traditions and significant innovations that mark this period as a transitional phase toward the fully developed Bronze Age societies that would emerge during the second millennium BC. The distinctive beaker pottery vessels that give this culture its name appear in burial contexts throughout Britain, typically associated with individual inhumations that contrast with the communal burial practices of the Neolithic period, suggesting changing conceptions of personhood, identity, and the afterlife that emphasized individual achievement and status, rather than collective group identity. The burial assemblages often include additional prestige items, such as copper daggers, stone wrist guards associated with archery, and occasionally gold ornaments that demonstrate both access to exotic materials and social differentiation based on control of these valuables. The appearance of the first metal objects in Britain, initially copper and gold, marks a technological threshold of immense historical significance, though the immediate practical impacts of these early metals remained limited by their scarcity and the superiority of stone tools for most everyday tasks during this transitional period. The knowledge of metallurgy, including techniques for extracting copper from ores through smelting, alloying copper with tin to produce bronze, and casting molten metal in shaped molds, represented specialized craft knowledge that would become increasingly important during the subsequent Bronze Age and would contribute to emerging patterns of social differentiation based on control of production and distribution of metal objects. The subsistence strategies of beaker populations continued to emphasize mixed farming, combining cereal agriculture with animal husbandry, though with some evidence for increasing importance of pastoral activities and possible seasonal mobility patterns that enabled exploitation of upland pastures during summer months while maintaining lowland settlements for winter, occupation, and crop cultivation. The field systems and settlement patterns of the early Bronze Age show both continuities with late Neolithic land use and gradual evolution toward more fixed and formalized landscape divisions, with the appearance of field boundaries, trackways, and settlement enclosures that demonstrate increasing investment in particular locations and perhaps emerging concepts of property rights and territorial control that differed from earlier Neolithic patterns. The populations inhabiting Britain during the early Bronze Age, genetically dominated by beaker-associated ancestry, would form the foundation for all subsequent British populations, including modern English people, who retained substantial proportions of this Bronze Age ancestry in their genetic makeup, despite the numerous subsequent population movements and admixture events that would add additional genetic components over the following 4,000 years. The Middle Bronze Age, extending from approximately 1500 to 1100 BC, witnessed the full development of metallurgical traditions and associated social transformations that characterize this period, with bronze objects becoming increasingly common and diverse in form, serving both practical functions as tools and weapons, and symbolic roles as prestige items, marking social status and facilitating exchange relationships. The technological improvements in metallurgy during this period enabled production of more sophisticated bronze implements, including socketed axes, spearheads, and eventually the first bronze swords, which required advanced casting techniques and represented both engineering achievements and potent symbols of martial prowess and social rank. The deposition of bronze objects in hoards, either isolated finds or associated with specific landscape features like rivers, bogs, or prominent hills, represents a widespread practice whose motivations remain subjects of scholarly interpretation, but likely involved complex combinations of practical storage, votive offerings to supernatural powers, and ritualized destruction or removal from circulation of valuable objects. The quantities of bronze objects deposited in some hoards, representing substantial investments of labor in their production, indicate either access to considerable resources by the individuals or groups responsible for these deposits or social obligations that required periodic removal of wealth from active circulation through ritual destruction or offering. The settlement patterns and landscape organization of the Middle Bronze Age demonstrate increasing formalization and permanence compared to earlier periods, with extensive field systems defined by banks, ditches, and stone walls appearing across many regions of Britain, and suggesting both increasing population densities and evolving concepts of land tenure and property rights. The roundhouse architecture that would characterize British domestic structures for over a millennium appears during this period, consisting of circular timber-framed buildings, typically 5 to 15 meters in diameter, with conical thatched roofs supported by internal post arrangements, representing functional and culturally meaningful architectural traditions that would persist with relatively little modification through the Iron Age and into the Roman period in some regions. The organization of these settlements, often consisting of scattered individual farmsteads or small clusters of households rather than nucleated villages, suggests social structures based primarily on extended family groups or small lineage segments rather than larger community organizations. Though the existence of hill forts and other communal constructions indicates capabilities for larger-scale cooperation when circumstances required, the evidence for agricultural intensification during this period, including the expansion of field systems into previously uncultivated upland areas and the development of more complex crop rotation and land management strategies, suggests increasing population pressures and perhaps evolving social relationships to land and resources that required more intensive exploitation to support growing communities. The Late Bronze Age, beginning around 1100 BC, witnessed significant social and economic transformations that would establish many of the patterns that would characterize the subsequent Iron Age, including evidence for increasing warfare or intergroup conflict, visible through fortification of hilltop sites, deposition of weapons in ritual contexts, and occasional skeletal remains showing evidence of violence. The hill forts that began appearing during this period, consisting of defended enclosures on prominent hilltop locations, surrounded by substantial earthwork ramparts and ditches, served multiple functions, including defensive strongholds during periods of conflict, high-status residences for emerging elite groups, communal gathering places for dispersed populations, and symbolic markers of territorial control and group identity. The labor investments required for construction of these monuments, involving the movement of thousands of cubic meters of earth and stone, and the construction of elaborate entrance works and internal structures, demonstrate organizational capacities comparable to or exceeding those visible in earlier Neolithic monument construction, though now deployed towards structures with clearer practical defensive functions rather than the primarily ritual purposes of earlier monuments. The distribution and scale of hill forts varied considerably across different regions of Britain, with particular concentrations in areas like the Welsh Marches and southwestern England, where dozens of these sites attest to either dense populations or intensive intergroup competition that necessitated defensive measures. The appearance of bronze swords during the Late Bronze Age marks both a technological development in metallurgy and potentially significant changes in warfare practices and social organization, as these weapons represented specialized implements designed exclusively for combat, rather than serving dual purposes as tools and weapons, like earlier bronze axes and spearheads. The evolution of sword designs through the Late Bronze Age, from leaf-shaped blades to more standardized forms with evolved hilts and improved balance, demonstrates ongoing experimentation and refinement of weapon technology in response to practical combat experience. The restriction of sword ownership to a relatively small proportion of the population, indicated by their occurrence primarily in wealthy burials and hoards, rather than as common finds, suggests that these weapons served as markers of elite warrior status, and that martial prowess and the ability to deploy violence effectively had become increasingly important foundations for social status and political authority. The emergence of warrior elites during the Late Bronze Age foreshadows the more fully developed hierarchical societies of the Iron Age, with power increasingly concentrated in the hands of individuals and lineages who could command the resources necessary for equipping and maintaining armed followers. The transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, conventionally dated to approximately 800 BC in Britain, represented less a dramatic transformation than a gradual evolution of existing social patterns and technological traditions, with the critical innovation being the adoption of iron-working technologies that would eventually displace bronze for most practical applications. While bronze continued to be used for prestige items and ritual objects, The adoption of ironworking in Britain, like the earlier introduction of copper and bronze metallurgy, involved the transfer of knowledge from continental sources, where these technologies had developed earlier, though the specific mechanisms of technological transfer remain unclear and likely involved both movement of skilled smiths and transmission of technical knowledge through existing exchange networks. The advantages of iron over bronze for practical tools and weapons derived primarily from the greater abundance and wider distribution of iron ores compared to the copper and tin sources required for bronze production, enabling more widespread access to metal implements and reducing dependence on long-distance exchange networks for acquiring raw materials. The technological challenges of iron working, including the higher temperatures required for smelting and the more complex forging techniques needed to produce serviceable implements, initially limited iron adoption to specialized craft producers, but over time, these technologies diffused widely and enabled the production of iron tools and weapons that would transform agriculture, craft production, and warfare. The Iron Age societies that developed in Britain during the first millennium BC, while showing regional variations in settlement patterns, material culture traditions, and social organizations, generally shared certain common characteristics, including mixed agricultural economies, emphasizing both arable farming and animal husbandry, settlement in dispersed farmsteads or small villages rather than large urban centers, construction and use of hill forts for various defensive, residential, and ritual purposes, and social structures that featured increasingly clear differentiation between elite and common populations. The genetic composition of Iron Age populations in Britain remained fundamentally similar to that of the Bronze Age populations, who had inhabited these territories for over a millennium, with ancient DNA evidence showing continuity of the beaker-associated ancestry that had come to predominate during the transition to the Bronze Age. However, this genetic continuity did not preclude ongoing contacts with continental populations or the arrival of small numbers of migrants who contributed cultural innovations and maintained connections between Britain and the broader European Iron Age world. The question of whether these Iron Age populations should be considered Celtic depends on how that term is defined, with linguistic evidence clearly demonstrating that the languages spoken in Britain during this period belong to the Celtic branch of Indo-European languages and shared features with contemporary Celtic languages spoken across much of Western Europe, while the extent to which British populations participated in broader Celtic cultural practices and identity remains more ambiguous. The archaeological evidence for contacts between Iron Age Britain and continental Celtic populations includes the appearance of Latin-style metalwork, featuring characteristic curvilinear decorative motifs, the adoption of new pottery traditions showing continental influences, the introduction of coinage based on continental prototypes, and textual references from classical authors that describe the inhabitants of Britain using terminology that links them to continental Celtic groups. The hill forts that characterize Iron Age settlement patterns across much of Britain, while showing some similarities to contemporary fortified sites in continental Celtic regions, also display distinctive insular characteristics that reflect local traditions and environmental adaptations, suggesting that British populations participated in broader European cultural developments while maintaining distinct regional identities. The social organization visible through Iron Age archaeology suggests societies led by warrior aristocracies who derived their power and status from martial prowess, control of agricultural surplus production, and ability to mobilize followers for warfare and large-scale construction projects, patterns that show general similarities to contemporary continental Celtic societies described in classical sources, though with variations reflecting local conditions and historical developments. The evidence for Iron Age religious practices and beliefs derives primarily from archaeological evidence of ritual deposits, unusual burials, and specialized monuments, as the absence of written sources from Britain during this period means that understanding of ideology and religion must be inferred from material remains rather than accessed through direct textual evidence. The practice of depositing valuable objects, including weapons, metalwork, and occasionally human remains in wet contexts like rivers, lakes, and bogs continued traditions established during the Bronze Age, but appears to have intensified during the Iron Age, suggesting the importance of watery locations in ritual practices and beliefs about communication with supernatural powers. The appearance of specialized ritual sites, including square enclosures defined by ditches and banks, often containing evidence of feasting, animal sacrifice, and structured deposits, demonstrates the existence of formalized religious practices and perhaps specialized religious practitioners or priesthoods responsible for conducting rituals and maintaining relationships with supernatural powers. The occasional discovery of bog bodies, human remains preserved in peat deposits, showing evidence of violent deaths and careful deposition that suggests ritual execution or sacrifice, provides disturbing evidence for religious practices that included human offerings, though whether these represents judicial executions, war captives, or volunteers for ritual sacrifice remains impossible to determine from archaeological evidence alone. The population of Iron Age Britain, while impossible to estimate with precision, certainly numbered in the hundreds of thousands and possibly exceeded 1 million by the late Iron Age, distributed across the landscape in patterns that concentrated populations in areas of favorable agricultural land while leaving extensive upland and forested regions sparsely inhabited. The carrying capacity of Iron Age agricultural systems, dependent on crop yields achievable with available technology and subject to annual variations in weather and crop success, imposed limits on population densities that could be sustained in particular regions, while the absence of urban centers meant that population remained dispersed across the landscape rather than concentrated in cities, as would occur during the Roman period. The health and nutritional status of Iron Age populations, as reconstructed from skeletal evidence, generally appears adequate, though with evidence for periodic nutritional stress, infectious diseases, and trauma resulting from accidents and violence that were endemic features of life during this period. The life expectancy at birth likely remained below 30 years for the population as a whole, with high infant and child mortality offsetting the longevity achieved by those individuals who survived to adulthood, creating demographic structures where populations remained young on average and where the elderly represented rare and potentially socially significant individuals who had accumulated knowledge and experience over unusually long lifespans. The late Iron Age, encompassing the final 2 centuries BC and the early 1st century AD, witnessed increasing contacts between Britain and the Roman world, with trade relationships bringing Roman goods, including wine, fine pottery, and luxury items to British elites, while British exports of agricultural products, metals, and slaves flowed southward to Roman markets. These economic relationships contributed to social transformations within late Iron Age British societies, with certain regions and populations developing particularly strong connections to the Roman world and adopting aspects of Roman material culture and social practices even before direct Roman military intervention. The emergence of identifiable political units or tribal groupings during the late Iron Age, known from references in classical sources and from the distribution of coin types bearing names that may represent rulers or polities, suggests the development of more complex political organization, transcending the local level and capable of coordinating activities across territories encompassing thousands of square kilometers. The appearance of substantial settlements that approach urban scale, including sites like Colchester in eastern England, marks the beginning of town development in Britain and demonstrates the influence of continental models of urbanization on late Iron Age British societies. These developments established the social and political conditions that would shape British responses to Roman conquest and would influence the subsequent integration of Britain into the Roman Empire. The Roman conquest of Britain, initiated by Emperor Claudius in AD 43, brought the southern and eastern portions of the island under direct Roman control and integrated these territories into the Mediterranean-centered Roman imperial system, exposing British populations to new technologies, social practices, religious traditions, and population movements that would significantly influence subsequent demographic and cultural developments. The military campaigns that established Roman control proceeded through a combination of direct military conquest of resisting populations and negotiated agreements with cooperative British leaders who saw advantages in aligning themselves with Roman power, creating a patchwork of directly administered territories, client kingdoms that maintained nominal independence while acknowledging Roman supremacy, and unconquered regions beyond Roman control, where indigenous Iron Age societies continued with minimal Roman interference. The Roman military forces responsible for conquest and occupation consisted primarily of legions recruited from Roman citizens drawn from across the empire, supplemented by larger numbers of auxiliary units, recruited from provincial populations and employed in military service in regions distant from their homelands, creating a cosmopolitan military force that brought together individuals from diverse ethnic backgrounds and exposed British populations to the diversity of the Roman Empire. The establishment of Roman military installations, including legionary fortresses, auxiliary forts, and associated civilian settlements, created nodes of intensive Roman presence distributed across the conquered territories, with these military sites serving both as bases for controlling subject populations and as centers for economic activity that attracted merchants, craft producers, and service providers who supplied the military garrison's needs. The construction of road networks connecting military installations and administrative centers, built according to Roman engineering standards, featuring carefully engineered routes, solid foundations, and drained surfaces that enabled all-weather transportation, transformed communication and transportation across Britain, while creating infrastructure that would remain in use long after the collapse of Roman authority. The development of civilian towns at sites of administrative importance, military camps, or favorable commercial locations introduced urban living to Britain on a scale not previously seen, with these towns featuring characteristic Roman urban amenities, including forum and basilica, complexes for administration and commerce, bath buildings, providing Roman-style bathing facilities, temples for various cults, amphitheaters for public entertainment, and water supply and drainage systems that supported urban population densities impossible with Iron Age technology. The population of these towns, while modest by Mediterranean standards, with the largest British urban centres probably never exceeding 20,000 inhabitants, represented unprecedented concentrations of people living in close proximity and created environments where diverse populations mixed and where Roman cultural practices could be observed and potentially adopted by British populations. The social transformations accompanying Roman conquest affected different populations in different ways, with elite British populations who cooperated with Roman authority, often prospering through access to Roman markets, administrative positions, and cultural capital associated with adoption of Roman lifestyles, while other populations experienced displacement, exploitation, or resistance leading to violent suppression and social disruption. The Romano-British villa system that developed during the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, featuring substantial stone-built farmhouses, often decorated with mosaics, and featuring Roman-style amenities like bathhouses and underfloor heating, demonstrates the adoption of Roman material culture and architectural styles by wealthy British landowners who sought to display their status and civilization through emulation of Roman elite practices. These establishments represented the centers of agricultural estates that exploited surrounding farmland, using labor forces that likely included enslaved individuals, as well as dependent tenants and hired workers, creating economic relationships that differed from Iron Age patterns while building on existing traditions of elite control of agricultural production. The distribution of villas concentrated in regions of favorable agricultural land in southeastern and southwestern Britain, while remaining rare or absent in northern and western regions, reflects both environmental factors affecting agricultural productivity and regional variations in the extent of integration into Roman economic and social systems. The genetic impacts of Roman occupation on British populations remain subjects of ongoing research and debate, with ancient DNA evidence providing somewhat contradictory signals about the scale of population movement between Roman territories and Britain during this period. The presence of Roman military forces, who included recruits from across the empire and who often retired and settled in the regions where they had served, certainly introduced some genetic diversity into British populations, particularly in areas near military installations where retired soldiers established families and communities. The development of commercial and administrative connections between Britain and other Roman provinces facilitated population movement by merchants, administrators, and others whose economic or political activities brought them to Britain, contributing additional genetic diversity to urban populations, though likely having limited impact on rural populations who continued traditional agricultural lifestyles with less direct engagement with imperial systems. The overall genetic evidence suggests that while Roman occupation introduced some new genetic elements into British populations, the demographic impacts remained substantially less dramatic than those associated with either the Neolithic or Bronze Age transitions, with British populations maintaining predominantly the same genetic profile throughout the Roman period, despite the significant cultural and social transformations occurring during these centuries. The religious landscape of Roman Britain reflected the characteristic Roman pattern of religious pluralism, with traditional Celtic deities continuing to receive worship alongside newly introduced Roman gods, Eastern mystery cults, and eventually Christianity, creating a complex religious environment where multiple traditions coexisted and interacted. The Interpretatio Romana, the Roman practice of identifying indigenous deities with Roman counterparts based on perceived similarities in function or character, created syncretistic religious forms where Celtic and Roman divine identities merged, with inscriptions frequently addressing hybrid deities, using both Celtic and Roman names. The introduction of Mediterranean religious cults, including those of Mithras, Isis, and Cybele, brought new ritual practices and religious communities to Britain, with archaeological evidence of temples dedicated to these deities, indicating the presence of worshippers who maintained these traditions far from their regions of origin. The arrival of Christianity during the later Roman period, initially as a minority religion, primarily attracting urban populations before spreading more widely during the 4th century AD, following imperial endorsement under Constantine, introduced a monotheistic religious tradition that would ultimately transform British religious life, though remaining a minority practice during the Roman period itself. The crisis of the 3rd century AD, when the Roman Empire faced simultaneous pressures from external invasions, internal political instability, economic disruption, and demographic decline due to epidemic diseases, affected Britain along with other imperial provinces, though the specific manifestations of crisis conditions varied regionally. The withdrawal of Roman military forces from Britain for deployment to other crisis zones, combined with increased raiding by peoples from beyond Roman frontiers, including Picts from Scotland and Saxon raiders from across the North Sea, created security challenges that strained the imperial government's ability to maintain order and control. The economic disruptions associated with imperial crisis affected Britain's integration into imperial trade networks, with evidence for declining importation of Mediterranean goods and contraction of urban populations, suggesting reduced commercial connections and economic vitality. The recovery during the 4th century AD, under the reforms of Diocletian and Constantine, restored Roman authority and enabled renewed economic activity, with evidence for continued occupation of villas and towns, demonstrating that Romano-British society remained viable despite the preceding disruptions. The final decades of Roman Britain, extending from approximately AD 380 to AD 410, witnessed the gradual breakdown of imperial authority and Roman administrative systems, creating conditions of increasing instability that would culminate in the formal end of Roman rule and the beginning of the post-Roman period. The military threats facing Britain intensified during this period, with coordinated attacks by Picts, Scots, and Saxon raiders in AD 367, requiring major military operations to restore security, while renewed attacks in subsequent decades demonstrated the ongoing vulnerability of Roman defensive systems. The usurpation of Magnus Maximus in AD 383, who withdrew military forces from Britain for his ultimately unsuccessful attempt to seize imperial power on the continent, weakened Britain's defences and established a precedent for military withdrawals that would be repeated in subsequent decades. The final breakdown of Roman authority occurred around AD 410, when the Romano-British population, facing continued external threats and lacking support from imperial authorities, who were themselves dealing with catastrophic pressures, including the sack of Rome by Visigoths in AD 410, began organizing their own defense and effectively ceased to acknowledge imperial sovereignty. The immediate post-Roman period in Britain, conventionally dated from approximately AD 410 to AD 600, represents one of the most poorly documented phases of British history, with the collapse of Roman administrative systems and literary culture, resulting in a near-total absence of contemporary written sources and creating what historians traditionally termed the Dark Ages, though more recent. Scholarship emphasizes that this darkness reflects primarily the absence of textual evidence, rather than necessarily indicating cultural collapse or social chaos. The archaeological evidence from this period, while increasing in quantity and sophistication of interpretation, remains challenging to interpret due to changes in material culture traditions, settlement patterns, and burial practices that complicate efforts to track population continuity or change. The genetic evidence from ancient DNA, extracted from individuals buried during the 5th and 6th centuries AD, provides the most direct evidence for population changes during this critical transition period, revealing patterns of significant genetic transformation that reflect substantial immigration from continental Germanic populations, who brought with them genetic signatures characteristic of regions corresponding to northern Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. The scale of this genetic transformation, while substantial, remained less complete than those associated with the Neolithic or Bronze Age transitions, with modern genetic studies suggesting that Anglo-Saxon migrations contributed approximately 20 to 40% of the ancestry of subsequent English populations, indicating significant, but not total, population replacement. The arrival of Germanic populations, traditionally termed Anglo-Saxons in historical sources, though this label encompasses diverse groups, including Angles from Denmark, Saxons from northern Germany, Jutes from Jutland, and others from various North Sea coastal regions, represented one of the most consequential demographic events in English ethnic history, fundamentally altering the genetic composition, linguistic character, and cultural traditions of the populations inhabiting eastern and southern Britain. The circumstances surrounding these migrations remain subject to scholarly debate, with traditional narratives derived from later sources like Bede's Ecclesiastical History, describing the initial arrival of Germanic warriors, hired as mercenaries by Romano-British leaders to defend against Pictish raids, followed by rebellion of these mercenaries and subsequent waves of Germanic migration that overwhelmed Romano-British resistance and established Anglo-Saxon political control over most of lowland Britain. The reliability of these traditional narratives remains questionable, given their composition centuries after the events they describe, leading modern scholars to propose alternative scenarios ranging from organized military conquest to gradual infiltration and demographic expansion to elite takeover, where small numbers of Germanic warriors established political control, while much of the Romano-British population remained in place and gradually adopted Anglo-Saxon cultural identity. The archaeological evidence for the 5th and 6th centuries AD reveals dramatic changes in settlement patterns, with Roman towns and villas largely abandoned or radically transformed and replaced by new settlement types featuring timber buildings, constructed using Germanic architectural traditions, creating a material culture landscape that appears fundamentally discontinuous with the preceding Roman period. The burial practices documented through excavation of cemeteries from this period show a mixture of inhumation and cremation, with grave goods frequently including weapons for male burials and jewelry and dress accessories for female burials, traditions with clear parallels in contemporary Germanic cemeteries in continental homelands. The pottery styles, metalwork, traditions, and other material culture elements appearing in 5th and 6th century Britain show strong similarities to contemporary productions from coastal regions of northern Germany and Denmark, supporting models of substantial population movement from these source regions to Britain. The linguistic transformation associated with Anglo-Saxon settlement, which resulted in the replacement of the Celtic Brythonic languages that had been spoken in Roman Britain with Old English, a Germanic language that would form the foundation for modern English, represents perhaps the most enduring legacy of this migration period. The mechanisms and timeline of linguistic replacement remain subjects of ongoing investigation, as linguistic change can proceed through various pathways, including complete population replacement, elite dominance, where small numbers of politically powerful speakers impose their language on subject populations, or bilingual transitions, where populations gradually shift from one language to another over multiple generations. The degree of linguistic replacement visible in the transition from Brythonic to Old English, with remarkably few Brythonic loanwords surviving in Old English, outside of place names and topographical terms, has traditionally been interpreted as evidence for substantial population replacement or for social conditions where Brythonic speakers faced powerful incentives to abandon their ancestral languages in favor of the language of politically dominant Anglo-Saxon elites. The survival of Brythonic place names for major geographical features, including rivers, hills, and some settlements, suggests that local geographic knowledge was transferred from earlier populations to Anglo-Saxon incomers, indicating at minimum some degree of interaction and knowledge transmission, even if the linguistic outcome ultimately favored overwhelming predominance of Germanic speech. The regional variations in place name evidence, with some areas showing higher frequencies of Brythonic survivals than others, suggests spatially variable patterns of interaction between Anglo-Saxon immigrants and indigenous Romano-British populations, with some regions perhaps experiencing more complete population replacement, while others witnessed greater population continuity despite Anglo-Saxon political and cultural dominance. The genetic evidence from ancient DNA analysis of individuals from 5th through 7th century burials provides direct insight into the biological ancestry of these populations and enables assessment of admixture patterns between immigrant and indigenous groups. The studies conducted on cemeteries from eastern England, regions that received the earliest and presumably heaviest Anglo-Saxon settlement, reveal populations with substantial Germanic genetic ancestry, though also showing evidence of continuing Romano-British genetic contributions, indicating population mixing rather than complete replacement. The variation between individuals buried in the same cemeteries, with some showing predominantly Germanic ancestry while others appear predominantly Romano-British, demonstrates that these communities included individuals from both population backgrounds, though the specific social relationships between these groups and the processes through which they came to be buried in common cemeteries remain subjects of investigation. The frequency of intermarriage between Anglo-Saxon immigrants and Romano-British populations represents a crucial question for understanding demographic dynamics during this period, as high rates of intermarriage would have facilitated genetic mixing and potentially eased social integration, while social barriers preventing or limiting intermarriage would have maintained population distinctions and potentially contributed to social tensions. The development of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms during the 6th and 7th centuries created new political structures that would shape English ethnic identity for centuries, with the emergence of multiple competing polities, including Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Sussex, Wessex, and Kent, dividing Britain among dynasties that claimed descent from Germanic royal lineages and that organized their territories according to social and political patterns derived from continental Germanic traditions. These kingdoms varied considerably in size, power, and cultural characteristics, with some, like Northumbria, achieving substantial territorial extent and political influence, while others remained minor polities, perpetually vulnerable to conquest by more powerful neighbors. The relationships between these kingdoms alternated between cooperation and conflict, with periods of hegemonic control by particularly powerful rulers termed Bretwalders, who exercised overlordship over multiple kingdoms, alternating with periods of decentralized power, when multiple kingdoms competed on relatively Bretwalders equal terms. The conversion of these kingdoms to Christianity during the 7th century, initiated both by missionaries sent from Rome under Augustine of Canterbury, beginning in AD 597, and by Irish missionaries working from northern bases established during Northumbria's Christian conversion, introduced new cultural influences and created connections to broader European Christian civilization, while transforming religious practices and beliefs. The impact of Christianization on Anglo-Saxon society extended far beyond religious practices to affect literacy, art, architecture, and social organization, with the establishment of monasteries introducing Latin learning and manuscript production that would preserve both religious texts and secular works, including historical chronicles that provide crucial evidence for reconstructing early Anglo-Saxon history. The monastic communities established during the 7th and 8th centuries, including famous centres like Lindisfarne, Jarrow, Monkwearmouth, and Whitby, became important centres of learning and artistic production, creating illuminated manuscripts like the Lindisfarne Gospels that rank among the masterpieces of medieval art and demonstrating the cultural sophistication achieved by Anglo-Saxon Christian civilization. The development of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms during the 7th through 9th centuries proceeded through cycles of competition and consolidation, with various kingdoms achieving temporary dominance before being superseded by rivals, gradually creating conditions that would enable eventual political unification of England under a single monarchy. The Kingdom of Mercia under rulers like Penda, Aethelbald, and Offa during the 7th and 8th centuries achieved dominance over much of Midland and southern England, with Offa, in particular, exercising power that enabled him to conduct diplomacy with Charlemagne and construct the massive earthwork known as Offa's Dyke that delineated the frontier between Mercia and Welsh kingdoms. The Viking Age, beginning with the raid on Lindisfarne in AD 793, initiated a new phase of Scandinavian influence on English ethnic development, bringing populations from Norway and Denmark to Britain through raiding, trading, and eventually settlement that would significantly impact the genetic composition and cultural traditions of English populations, particularly in northern and eastern regions. The initial phase of Viking activity, extending from the late 8th through the mid-9th centuries, consisted primarily of hit and run raids targeting monasteries and coastal settlements, with Viking forces exploiting superior ship technology and tactical mobility to strike vulnerable targets and withdraw before local defense forces could respond. The intensification of Viking activity during the mid-9th century, when raiders began operating in larger forces and establishing overwintering camps that enabled sustained campaigning, transformed the Viking threat from a maritime raiding problem into an existential challenge to Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that would fundamentally reshape the political and demographic landscape of England. The arrival of the Great Heathen Army in AD 865, a substantial military force that conducted coordinated campaigns, resulting in the conquest of Northumbria, East Anglia, and much of Mercia, marked the beginning of sustained Scandinavian settlement in northern and eastern England that would create the region known as the Danelaw. The establishment of Scandinavian-controlled territories in England created conditions for substantial Norse immigration, with settlers from Denmark and Norway establishing farms, villages, and towns that introduced Scandinavian cultural practices, linguistic influences, and genetic contributions to regions encompassing much of Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, East Anglia, and the East Midlands. The genetic evidence from modern English populations reveals elevated frequencies of Scandinavian ancestry in these regions, with studies suggesting that contemporary populations in areas of densest Viking settlement carry approximately 5 to 10% Scandinavian ancestry, indicating substantial, though not overwhelming, demographic impact from Norse immigration during the 9th and 10th centuries. The place name evidence provides additional insight into settlement patterns, with numerous locations featuring Scandinavian elements like by, meaning farm or village, thorp, meaning secondary settlement, and toft, meaning homestead, demonstrating the presence of Scandinavian-speaking populations who established the nomenclature that persists into the present era. The linguistic influences of Scandinavian settlement on English extended beyond place names to affect vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation, with Old Norse loanwords entering English in numbers exceeding those from any other source except Latin and French, including basic terms for everyday concepts and even grammatical elements that suggest intimate contact and bilingual communities where Norse and English speakers interacted regularly. The resistance to Viking conquest, led by the Kingdom of Wessex under Alfred the Great, who successfully defended his territories against Viking assault during the late 9th century, and subsequently negotiated the partition of England between Anglo-Saxon and Danish-controlled territories, established the political foundation for eventual English reunification under West Saxon leadership. Alfred's defensive strategies, including the construction of fortified berths at strategic locations throughout Wessex and the development of naval forces capable of challenging Viking maritime superiority, demonstrated innovative military responses to Viking threats, while his patronage of learning and literature initiated a revival of English scholarship that would preserve historical memory and cultural traditions through the tumultuous 9th century. The subsequent reconquest of Danish-controlled territories by Alfred's descendants during the early 10th century, culminating in the recovery of the last Danish-held regions during the AD 950s, reunified England under a single monarchy for the first time and created the political framework of the Kingdom of England that would persist through the medieval period and beyond. The degree of integration between Scandinavian settlers and Anglo-Saxon populations in the Danelaw region varied spatially and temporally, with some evidence suggesting relatively peaceful coexistence and intermarriage, while other sources describe conflict and social tensions between communities. The archaeological evidence from settlements and burials in the Danelaw region reveals mixed signals about ethnic identity and cultural practices, with some sites showing clear Scandinavian characteristics in architecture, material culture, and burial practices, while others appear more ambiguously mixed or maintain Anglo-Saxon traditions, despite being located in regions of heavy Scandinavian settlement. The linguistic evidence suggests substantial contact and bilingualism, with borrowings occurring in both directions and with grammatical simplification in English, possibly reflecting communication needs in bilingual communities. The legal and administrative traditions documented in later sources show distinctive characteristics in the Danelaw region, including legal terminology of Scandinavian origin and customary practices differing from those in regions of uninterrupted Anglo-Saxon control, suggesting lasting cultural impacts of Scandinavian settlement even after political reunification under English monarchy. The renewed Viking attacks during the late 10th and early 11th centuries, culminating in the conquest of England by the Danish king Knut in AD 1016, marked another phase of Scandinavian influence, though with different demographic impacts than the 9th century settlement period. Knut's reign from AD 1016 to 1035 established England as part of a North Sea empire, including Denmark and Norway, integrating English territories into Scandinavian political networks and facilitating continued contact between English and Scandinavian populations. The Danish control of England under Canute and his sons appears to have involved relatively limited new settlement, with Canute governing primarily through existing English administrative structures and aristocratic hierarchies, rather than importing large numbers of Danish settlers, though his military forces and administrative personnel certainly included Scandinavian individuals who settled in England and contributed to continued genetic mixing. The restoration of the Anglo-Saxon royal line under Edward the Confessor in AD 1042 re-established English political independence, though the kingdom's political stability remained fragile due to competing claims to the succession and the ambitions of powerful aristocratic families, including the Godwins, who accumulated substantial power during Edward's reign. The Norman conquest, initiated by William, Duke of Normandy's victory at the Battle of Hastings in AD 1066, represented another transformative moment in English ethnic history, introducing French-speaking Norman elites who would dominate English politics, land ownership, and ecclesiastical institutions for centuries, while contributing new genetic elements to English populations and substantially influencing English cultural and linguistic development. The Norman invading force, while modest in numbers compared to earlier Anglo-Saxon or Viking migrations, achieved complete political and social transformation through military conquest and systematic replacement of Anglo-Saxon aristocratic and ecclesiastical hierarchies with Norman appointees who owed loyalty to William and who established the feudal social and political structures characteristic of Norman rule. The scale of aristocratic replacement following the conquest was extraordinary, with the Domesday Book compiled in AD 1086 demonstrating that within 2 decades of Hastings, virtually every substantial landholding had passed from Anglo-Saxon to Norman control, creating a new ruling class that maintained political dominance for generations, while the bulk of the English population continued to consist of Anglo-Saxon peasants and townspeople living under Norman lordship. The genetic impact of the Norman conquest on English populations, while significant at elite levels, appears relatively modest in the population as a whole, due to the small numbers of Norman settlers relative to the existing English population. The Normans who settled in England following the conquest, including aristocratic families who received lands as rewards for supporting William's invasion, ecclesiastical personnel who received appointments to bishoprics and abbeys, and various retainers, administrators, and settlers who followed the Norman elite to England, probably numbered in the tens of thousands rather than hundreds of thousands, representing a small fraction of England's total population, which likely exceeded 1.5 million by the late 11th century. The demographic structure of Norman settlement skewed heavily toward aristocratic males, who frequently married English women, facilitated genetic mixing between Norman and Anglo-Saxon populations, while limiting the overall Norman genetic contribution, with modern genetic studies suggesting that populations of French ancestry contributed approximately 5% of the ancestry of modern English populations, substantially less than the contributions from earlier Anglo-Saxon or Viking migrations. The cultural impacts of the Norman conquest, particularly linguistic changes, proved far more substantial and enduring than the limited demographic effects. With the introduction of Norman French as the language of government, law, and aristocratic culture, creating a bilingual society where French and English coexisted for centuries with different social functions. The dominance of French among elites and in formal contexts introduced thousands of French loanwords into English, particularly in domains associated with government, law, military affairs, religion, cuisine, and courtly culture, while English continued as the spoken language of the majority population and eventually re-emerged as the dominant language of the kingdom by the late medieval period, having been substantially transformed through French influence. The eventual merger of French and English linguistic elements created Middle English, a language substantially different from Old English in vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation, but maintaining English rather than French as its fundamental structure and base vocabulary, demonstrating the resilience of English linguistic tradition despite the political dominance of French-speaking elites. The social and economic transformations accompanying Norman rule, including the full implementation of feudal landholding systems, construction of castles throughout England as centres of aristocratic power and instruments of social control, reform of ecclesiastical institutions according to continental models, and integration of England into broader European political and cultural networks, fundamentally reshaped English society, while the underlying population remained predominantly Anglo-Saxon in origin. The Norman aristocracy, despite maintaining French language and continental connections for generations, gradually developed distinctive Anglo-Norman identity that acknowledged their English territorial base while maintaining social distinction from the English peasantry they governed. The intermarriage between Norman aristocratic families and the relatively few Anglo-Saxon aristocratic lineages that retained status after the conquest created hybrid bloodlines that would eventually characterize the English nobility, though contemporaries maintained sharp social distinctions based on ancestry and French language competence that preserved Norman elite identity despite biological mixing. The following centuries of the medieval period witnessed gradual fusion of Norman and Anglo-Saxon populations into a coherent English ethnic identity, a process facilitated by the loss of Normandy to French royal control in AD 1204 that severed English aristocratic families' direct territorial connections to France, by the Hundred Years' War that created English national consciousness defined against French rivals, and by the gradual displacement of French by English as the dominant language, even among aristocratic and administrative contexts during the 14th and 15th centuries. The Black Death pandemic that struck England in AD 1348 and subsequent plague recurrences during the late medieval period caused catastrophic population losses estimated between 1/3 and 1/2 of the total population, creating labour shortages that strengthened the negotiating position of surviving peasants and contributed to the gradual breakdown of feudal social structures. While the demographic collapse removed a substantial proportion of the time population before they could contribute to future genetic inheritance, creating population bottlenecks that would influence the genetic composition of subsequent English populations. The late medieval period also witnessed significant internal migration from rural areas to growing towns and cities, with London in particular experiencing sustained population growth that required continued immigration from surrounding regions to offset mortality rates that exceeded births in the unsanitary urban environment, creating population mixing between regions and contributing to genetic homogenization, while urban populations developed distinctive disease exposures and possibly evolved genetic adaptations to urban pathogens. The Tudor period, beginning with Henry VII's accession in AD 1485, brought relative political stability after the civil conflicts of the Wars of the Roses, while the dynasty's policies encouraging commerce and overseas exploration began integrating England into emerging global trade networks that would eventually facilitate population movements on unprecedented scales. The Protestant Reformation, initiated by Henry VIII's break with Rome in the 1530s, transformed English religious life and cultural identity, establishing Protestantism as a core element of English national identity that distinguished England from Catholic powers, including Spain and France, while creating conditions that would attract Protestant refugees from continental religious conflicts in subsequent decades. The arrival of Protestant refugees, including Huguenots fleeing French religious persecution, Dutch and Flemish Protestants escaping Spanish rule, and others seeking religious freedom in Protestant England, contributed modest numbers of immigrants who introduced craft skills, commercial expertise, and genetic diversity to English populations, with these groups generally settling in towns and cities where their specialized skills found markets and where immigrant communities could provide social support during adjustment to English life. The early modern period witnessed continued evolution of English ethnic identity through processes of cultural consolidation that emphasized Protestant religion, English language, and historical narratives, emphasizing Anglo-Saxon heritage and constitutional traditions as foundations of national character, while economic and demographic changes associated with agricultural improvements, commercial expansion, and early industrialization transformed social structures and created new patterns of internal migration. The English colonization of Ireland, begun during the Tudor period and intensified under Cromwell during the 17th century, created reverse migration streams that would eventually bring Irish populations to England in substantial numbers, though the major phase of Irish immigration would not occur until the 19th century famine migration. The expansion of English maritime activities, including fishing, naval warfare, privateering, and eventually transatlantic colonization, created occupational groups with distinctive life experiences and possibly disease exposures that contributed to population differentiation within English society, with port cities developing cosmopolitan populations exposed to diverse foreign influences. The scientific revolution and enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries transformed English intellectual life and created new frameworks for understanding human diversity, with early anthropological and biological investigations beginning to document and classify human populations, though often through frameworks that emphasized racial hierarchies and that would contribute to ideologies supporting colonialism and slavery. The expansion of the British Empire during the 18th and 19th centuries integrated England into global networks of trade, migration, and cultural exchange, while establishing English as a global language and extending English cultural influence worldwide, processes that would eventually contribute to reverse migration streams, bringing populations from colonial territories to England, particularly during the 20th century. The Industrial Revolution, beginning in the mid-18th century, transformed English society through urbanization, factory production, and transportation improvements, including canals and railways that facilitated movement of people and goods, creating industrial cities that grew rapidly through rural-urban migration and that developed distinctive social and demographic characteristics, including high mortality rates, poor living conditions, and sharp class divisions. The 19th century witnessed continued industrialization and urbanization, alongside gradual political reforms that expanded voting rights and improved urban conditions, while scientific developments, including Darwin's theory of evolution, Mendel's genetics, and early anthropological studies began providing conceptual frameworks for understanding human biological diversity and inheritance. Though these frameworks often incorporated assumptions about racial hierarchies and eugenic theories that would have terrible consequences in the 20th century. The Irish famine migration of the 1840s brought hundreds of thousands of Irish immigrants to England, creating the largest immigrant influx in English history to that point, and contributing Irish genetic ancestry to English populations, particularly in northwestern industrial cities, where Irish immigrants concentrated, while also generating nativist reactions and social tensions that reflected ethnic and religious prejudices against Catholic Irish newcomers. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw continued immigration, including Jewish refugees, fleeing Russian pogroms and later Nazi persecution, Italian economic migrants, and various others attracted by economic opportunities in the world's leading industrial economy, contributing continued genetic diversity to English populations, though overall immigration remained modest relative to total population until the mid-20th century. The demographic catastrophes of World War I and World War II cost England hundreds of thousands of lives and created gender imbalances in the population structure, while the post-war period witnessed the dissolution of the British Empire and the migration of populations from former colonies to England, fundamentally transforming English ethnic composition and creating the multi-ethnic society characteristic of contemporary England. The arrival of Caribbean immigrants during the late 1940s and 50s through migration streams like the Empire Windrush, followed by South Asian immigrants from India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh during the 60s and 70s, and more recent migrations from Eastern Europe following European Union expansion, has created diverse urban populations, particularly in London and other major cities, while raising questions about English ethnic identity and the relationship between traditional Anglo-Saxon heritage and contemporary multicultural reality. The genetic studies of modern English populations reveal the accumulated effects of these millennia of migration, mixing, and demographic change, with the average English person carrying genetic ancestry derived predominantly from Bronze Age populations who established themselves in Britain over 4,000 years ago, supplemented by significant contributions from Anglo-Saxon migrations of the 5th and 6th centuries, more modest contributions from Viking settlers of the 9th and 10th centuries, minor contributions from Norman aristocracy of the 11th century, and small but increasing contributions from more recent immigrants from diverse global origins. The persistence of regional genetic and cultural variation within England reflects both geographical factors that created semi-isolated populations in remote areas and historical patterns of migration and settlement that concentrated particular ancestry components in specific regions, with genetic studies documenting north-south gradients in some ancestry components and east-west variations in others that reflect the accumulated effects of differential migration patterns throughout history. The genetic distance between populations in different parts of England remains modest compared to differences between England and other European regions, indicating substantial internal mixing and gene flow throughout English history, despite regional variations, with modern transportation and communication further homogenizing English populations through increased internal migration and intermarriage across regional boundaries. The question of who can be considered ethnically English remains contentious in contemporary debates, with competing definitions emphasizing biological ancestry, cultural participation in English traditions, self-identification, or legal citizenship, reflecting broader tensions about national identity in multicultural societies and the relationship between historical ethnic heritage and contemporary demographic diversity. The scientific understanding of English ethnic history has been revolutionized over the past 2 decades through the development and application of ancient DNA analysis techniques that enable direct investigation of genetic ancestry, skeletal remains from archaeological contexts, providing unprecedented insight into population movements, admixture events, and demographic processes that were previously accessible only through indirect inferences from archaeological and linguistic evidence. The pioneering studies in this field, beginning with successful extraction and sequencing of DNA from Neolithic and Bronze Age skeletal remains during the early 21st century, demonstrated the feasibility of recovering usable genetic material from ancient bones and teeth, despite degradation processes that fragment DNA and introduce contamination from soil microorganisms. The subsequent development of next-generation sequencing technologies and computational methods for distinguishing authentic ancient DNA from modern contamination enabled systematic investigation of ancient populations, generating datasets, documenting genetic continuity and change across thousands of years, and fundamentally revising scholarly understanding of British demographic history. The methodology employed in ancient DNA studies involves careful selection of skeletal remains from well-documented archaeological contexts, extraction of DNA from bones or teeth using specialized techniques that minimize contamination, sequencing of the extracted DNA using high-throughput technologies, and computational analysis comparing ancient genetic sequences to reference datasets from modern and other ancient populations to infer ancestry relationships and demographic processes. The challenges inherent in this research include the rarity of skeletal remains with sufficient DNA preservation, the difficulties of distinguishing authentic ancient DNA from contamination, the complexities of inferring population-level processes from limited samples of individuals, and the ethical issues surrounding analysis of human remains without possibility of informed consent from the deceased individuals or their descendants. Despite these challenges, the accumulating body of ancient DNA evidence has generated robust conclusions about major demographic transitions in British prehistory and history, documenting the Neolithic population replacement, the Bronze Age transformation associated with Beaker migrations, the Anglo-Saxon admixture event, and the Viking genetic contributions, while also revealing unexpected patterns, including the limited genetic impact of Roman occupation and the modest Norman contribution. The integration of ancient DNA evidence with archaeological, linguistic, and historical sources creates opportunities for multidisciplinary synthesis that can address questions about population history with unprecedented rigor and detail, though this integration also raises methodological challenges about how to weight different types of evidence and resolve apparent contradictions between genetic patterns and traditional historical narratives. The genetic evidence has generally confirmed the reality of major migration events inferred from archaeological and linguistic evidence, including the Neolithic transition, Beaker arrival, and Anglo-Saxon migrations, while also quantifying the demographic scale of these events and revealing aspects of population mixing and continuity that were not apparent from material culture evidence alone. The genetic studies have also generated some surprises, including the completeness of population replacement during the Neolithic and Bronze Age transitions, which exceeded most scholars' expectations based on archaeological evidence, and the modest genetic impact of Roman occupation, which suggests that while Roman rule substantially transformed British culture and society, it did not involve massive demographic replacement or extensive immigration from Mediterranean regions. The implications of ancient DNA research extend beyond academic understanding of population history to engage with contemporary debates about identity, ancestry, and the meaning of ethnicity in genetically diverse societies. The scientific demonstration that modern English populations carry genetic ancestry from diverse sources, including Neolithic farmers from the Near East, Bronze Age, steppe populations from Eastern Europe, Iron Age, Celtic populations from Western Europe, Germanic Anglo-Saxons from coastal regions of northwestern Europe, Scandinavian Vikings, Norman French, and various more recent immigrant groups, challenges simplistic notions of ethnic purity and demonstrates that English ethnicity represents a composite identity built from multiple ancestral sources mixed over thousands of years. The recognition that genetic ancestry, cultural identity, and linguistic heritage represent distinct, though related aspects of ethnicity that need not align, perfectly complicates efforts to define who counts as ethnically English, and suggests that English ethnicity might be better understood as a historically evolved cultural tradition to which individuals from diverse biological backgrounds can belong, rather than as a biologically defined population with clear genetic boundaries. The regional variations in genetic ancestry within England, documented through analysis of both ancient DNA from archaeological contexts and modern DNA from living populations, reveal complex patterns reflecting differential migration impacts in different regions, with some areas experiencing heavier Anglo-Saxon settlement visible through elevated Germanic ancestry, other regions showing stronger Viking genetic signals, and western and northern areas maintaining higher frequencies of pre-Anglo-Saxon ancestry. These regional patterns correspond to some extent with traditional cultural and dialectical divisions within England, suggesting that genetic ancestry and cultural traditions have reinforced each other through preferential marriage within regional populations. Though modern internal migration has substantially homogenized English populations and reduced regional genetic structure, the genetic distances between different English regional populations remain far smaller than those separating English populations from other European groups, confirming that despite internal variation, English populations share substantial common ancestry and constitute a genetically coherent population at the European scale. The investigation of phenotypic traits, including pigmentation, facial features, and disease susceptibilities in ancient English populations, provides additional dimensions to understanding English ethnic history beyond simple ancestry proportions, revealing how the genetic changes accompanying migration events affected the physical appearance and health characteristics of English populations over time. The dramatic shift in skin pigmentation from the dark-skinned Mesolithic inhabitants, exemplified by Cheddar Man, to the lighter-skinned Neolithic and Bronze Age populations associated with farming and steppe ancestry, reflects genetic adaptations to reduced UV exposure in northern latitudes and dietary changes affecting vitamin D metabolism, creating the pale complexions characteristic of northern European populations, including the English. The genetic variants affecting hair color, eye color, and other visible traits underwent frequency changes associated with different migration events, with the blue and green eye colors common in modern English populations, deriving from various ancestral sources, including both indigenous European hunter-gatherers and incoming steppe populations, while the red hair variant, common in northwestern European populations, including parts of England, reflects genetic variants that reached high frequencies through founder effects and genetic drift in isolated populations. The disease susceptibility landscape of English populations reflects their complex genetic ancestry and demographic history, with different ancestry components contributing genetic variants that affect susceptibility to various conditions, including autoimmune diseases, cardiovascular conditions, metabolic disorders, and infectious diseases. The genetic variants affecting lactose tolerance, which enables adult consumption of dairy products, reached high frequencies in English populations through positive selection during the Bronze Age and Iron Age, when pastoral economies made dairy products important dietary components, creating one of the highest frequencies of lactose tolerance globally in modern English populations. The genetic variants affecting immune system function show complex patterns, reflecting the disease environments experienced by different ancestral populations, with some variants providing resistance to specific pathogens, endemic in particular regions, while potentially increasing susceptibility to other conditions, creating the distinctive disease susceptibility profile of modern English populations. The future trajectory of English ethnic composition remains uncertain and will depend on migration policies, birth rate differentials between populations of different ancestries, and patterns of intermarriage that will determine whether recent immigrant populations maintain genetic distinctiveness or become integrated into the broader English gene pool. The current trends toward increased genetic diversity in England, driven by immigration from diverse global sources and settlement patterns that concentrate recent immigrants in urban areas, while rural populations remain more homogeneous, are creating increasingly heterogeneous populations, particularly in major cities where traditional ethnic English populations now constitute minorities in some local areas. The social and political implications of these demographic changes have generated substantial debate about English national identity, integration policies, and the future character of English society, with different perspectives, emphasizing either the importance of maintaining cultural continuity with historical English traditions or the potential benefits of diversity and the inevitability of continued ethnic evolution in an interconnected globalized world. The scientific study of English ethnicity through genetic, archaeological, linguistic, and historical approaches demonstrates that English ethnic identity represents the outcome of complex historical processes involving multiple migration events, population mixing, cultural transmission, and collective identity formation, spanning millennia, rather than reflecting simple biological inheritance from a single ancestral population. The recognition that ethnicity involves both biological ancestry and cultural identification, which may not align perfectly, and which individuals and groups negotiate through social processes, complicates efforts to draw clear boundaries around English ethnicity and suggests that inclusive definitions, acknowledging the legitimacy of both hereditary and acquired English identity, may be most appropriate for contemporary, multi-ethnic English society. The deep historical roots of English ethnicity, extending back through Anglo-Saxon migrations, Roman occupation, Iron Age, Celtic populations, Bronze Age transformations, Neolithic farming communities, and ultimately to Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, demonstrate remarkable continuity alongside dramatic changes, with the genetic evidence revealing that modern English populations maintain connections to ancient inhabitants, despite the numerous demographic transformations that have reshaped British populations over 10,000 years of continuous human occupation. The story of English ethnicity ultimately represents a chapter in the broader narrative of human migration and population mixing that has characterized our species throughout its existence, with the particular combination of migrations affecting Britain, creating the distinctive genetic and cultural profile of English populations, while demonstrating the general principle that all human populations represent mixtures of diverse, ancestral sources combined through historical processes of movement, contact, and interbreeding. The contemporary relevance of understanding English ethnic history extends beyond academic interest to inform debates about immigration, national identity, and social cohesion in modern England, with historical perspective potentially contributing to more nuanced discussions that acknowledge both the importance of cultural continuity and the reality of perpetual demographic change throughout English history. The accumulated scientific evidence from ancient DNA analysis, archaeological investigation, linguistic study, and historical research has generated increasingly detailed and robust understanding of English ethnic formation, while also revealing the complexity and contingency of historical processes that defy simple narratives and that demonstrate the remarkable capacity of human populations to absorb, adapt, and transform while maintaining sense of collective identity across generations. The consolidation of English ethnic identity during the High Medieval period, extending from the 12th through 14th centuries, proceeded through processes that increasingly emphasized common participation in English legal traditions, use of the English language as a marker of collective identity, distinct from both Celtic populations in Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, and from French-speaking continental populations, and shared historical narratives that constructed genealogies connecting contemporary populations to Anglo-Saxon ancestors, while acknowledging the Norman contribution to English political and social structures. The reign of Henry II from 1154 to 1189 established legal and administrative innovations, including the development of common law traditions that would become foundational to English identity, creating uniform legal procedures applied across the kingdom and accessible through royal courts that gradually displaced local customary law systems, while the expansion of royal administration created bureaucratic structures that required increasing numbers of literate administrators whose training in Latin and eventually French created educated classes whose linguistic practices differed from the English-speaking majority. The Angevin Empire, assembled by Henry II through inheritance and marriage, encompassing territories stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, created a political entity that transcended England, proper and complicated efforts to define English identity in purely territorial terms, though the subsequent loss of continental territories during the 13th century would contribute to more clearly defined English national consciousness. The development of Parliament during the 13th century, as an institution representing various estates of the realm, including not only aristocratic magnates and ecclesiastical authorities, but eventually also representatives from towns and counties, created frameworks for political participation that would become central to English constitutional traditions and that facilitated the emergence of political identities based on participation in English governance rather than purely on ethnic ancestry. The conflicts between royal authority and baronial power that characterized much of the 13th century, culminating in the Magna Carta of 1215 and subsequent constitutional developments, established principles of limited monarchy and rule of law that would become integral to English political culture, and that differentiated English governance traditions from more absolutist continental models. The gradual displacement of French by English in official contexts during the 14th century, driven by the losses of French territories that reduced aristocratic connections to France, and by the nationalist sentiments generated during the Hundred Years' War, marked a critical transition in linguistic practices that reflected and reinforced emerging English national identity based on common language rather than on aristocratic French culture. The economic transformations of the high medieval period, including agricultural expansion that brought marginal lands under cultivation to support growing populations, development of market towns and commercial networks that integrated regional economies into national and international trading systems, and gradual monetization that replaced labor services with cash payments and facilitated social mobility, created conditions for population mixing and economic differentiation that cross-cut regional and ancestral identities. The expansion of towns during the 12th and 13th centuries, when populations of urban centres like London, York, Bristol, and Norwich grew substantially through migration from surrounding rural areas, created environments where individuals from diverse regional backgrounds interacted and intermarried, contributing to genetic homogenization, while urban environments developed distinctive demographic characteristics, including higher mortality rates that required continued immigration to maintain population levels. The commercial connections established during this period, linking English wool production to Flemish cloth manufacture and connecting English ports to wider European and Mediterranean trading networks, facilitated movement of merchants, craftsmen, and sailors whose occupational activities exposed them to foreign populations and whose settlement in English ports contributed modest but continuous genetic diversity to coastal populations. The catastrophic demographic collapse associated with the Black Death pandemic that arrived in England during the summer of 1348, spreading rapidly from southern ports throughout the country and killing an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the total population within 2 years, represented the most severe mortality crisis in English history and fundamentally altered demographic structures, economic relationships, and social hierarchies in ways that would influence subsequent ethnic development. The disease, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis and transmitted through flea vectors associated with black rats that thrived in the unsanitary conditions characteristic of medieval settlements, exploited the dense human populations and extensive trade networks of the 14th century to spread with devastating speed, with mortality rates varying regionally but reaching catastrophic levels in densely populated areas, including towns and monastic communities. The social and economic consequences of this demographic catastrophe extended far beyond the immediate mortality, as labor shortages resulting from population losses strengthened the bargaining position of surviving peasants and workers who could demand higher wages and better conditions, undermining the feudal labor services and social hierarchies that had characterized medieval English society and contributing to social conflicts, including the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, that challenged aristocratic privilege and demanded greater social equality. The genetic consequences of the Black Death involved both immediate effects through the removal of substantial proportions of the population before they could reproduce, and longer-term selection pressures that potentially favored genetic variants conferring resistance to plague or other epidemic diseases that would recur repeatedly during the late medieval and early modern periods. The survivors of the initial Black Death outbreak, who passed their genes to subsequent generations, may have included disproportionate numbers of individuals carrying genetic variants that provided some protection against plague infection or that moderated disease severity, though the specific genetic mechanisms of plague resistance remain incompletely understood, and the strength of selection pressures exerted by plague on human populations remains subject to ongoing investigation. The repeated plague outbreaks, occurring throughout the late 14th and 15th centuries, including major epidemics in 1361, 1369, and at various later intervals, maintained selection pressures while preventing population recovery to pre-plague levels for over a century, creating demographic conditions where marriage patterns, inheritance practices, and social structures adapted to conditions of population scarcity rather than the population pressure that had characterized the pre-plague period. The late medieval period witnessed continued evolution of English ethnic identity through processes that increasingly emphasized linguistic uniformity, with the triumph of English over French in elite contexts by the late 14th century, creating conditions where English language became the primary marker of Englishness, while regional dialects maintained substantial variation that reflected historical patterns of migration and settlement. The literary flowering of the 14th century, exemplified by Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in Middle English during the 1380s and 1390s, demonstrated the sophistication achievable in English literary expression and contributed to the prestige of English as a language suitable for sophisticated cultural production rather than merely for everyday communication among common people. The standardization of written English that began during the 15th century, driven by the administrative needs of royal government and facilitated by the introduction of printing technology during the 1470s, created increasingly uniform written forms despite continued regional variation in spoken dialects, establishing foundations for the modern Standard English that would eventually become a global language, while obscuring the extent of linguistic diversity that characterized medieval English speech. The Wars of the Roses that engulfed England in sporadic civil warfare between 1455 and 1485, pitting Lancastrian and Yorkist factions in struggles for royal succession, disrupted social and political order while demonstrating the weakness of the monarchical institutions and the power of aristocratic factions whose armed retinues could challenge royal authority. The demographic impacts of these conflicts, while substantial for aristocratic families who suffered high mortality rates through battle casualties and political executions, affected the broader population relatively lightly, as much of the warfare consisted of relatively small-scale engagements between aristocratic armies rather than general mobilizations of the population, leaving most English people to continue their agricultural and commercial activities with limited direct involvement in the dynastic struggles. The resolution of these conflicts through Henry Tudor's victory at Bosworth Field in 1485 and his subsequent marriage to Elizabeth of York that united the competing dynastic claims, established the Tudor dynasty that would rule England for over a century and that would preside over transformations in religious practice, political organization, and international relations that would fundamentally reshape English society. The Tudor period represented a crucial phase in the development of English national identity and the consolidation of English ethnic consciousness through religious reformation that created distinctive English Protestant traditions, political centralization that strengthened royal authority while developing parliamentary institutions, cultural flowering that produced remarkable literary and artistic achievements, and initial overseas expansion that would eventually create a global British Empire. The break with Rome initiated by Henry VIII during the 1530s, motivated by the Pope's refusal to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, but reflecting broader political and economic tensions between English monarchy and papal authority, transformed English religious life by establishing royal supremacy over the English Church, dissolving monasteries, and confiscating ecclesiastical properties that were redistributed to royal supporters, and initiating Protestant reforms that would be advanced and retreated through subsequent reigns before achieving relatively stable form under Elizabeth I. The religious changes accompanying the English Reformation created new bases for English identity, defined by Protestant Christianity, in opposition to Catholic powers, including Spain and France, contributing to nationalist sentiments that portrayed England as a chosen nation with special divine favor and mission, while the suppression of monasteries eliminated institutions that had preserved learning and provided social services, while creating opportunities for redistribution of wealth that strengthened the gentry classes, who became major beneficiaries of confiscated ecclesiastical properties. The settlement of religious controversies during Elizabeth I's reign from 1558 to 1603, establishing a via media that attempted to accommodate both Protestant and moderate Catholic sensibilities within a comprehensive English church, created religious institutions that would become central to English identity, while failing to satisfy more radical Protestants who sought further reformation, or Catholics who rejected the entire Protestant project. The development of the Book of Common Prayer as the liturgical standard for English worship, written in English rather than Latin and prescribed for use throughout the kingdom, created common religious practices and language that contributed to national unity, while the English Bible translations authorized during this period made scripture accessible in vernacular language and influenced English literary development through the memorable phrasing and cadences of biblical language. The Elizabethan era witnessed remarkable cultural achievements, including the literary works of William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, Edmund Spenser, and others, whose writings in English demonstrated the expressive power and flexibility of the language, while contributing to the prestige of English literature and the musical compositions of English composers like Thomas Tallis and William Byrd, who created distinctive English musical traditions, drawing on both continental influences and native traditions. The overseas expansion initiated during the Tudor period, including exploratory voyages to North America, the beginnings of transatlantic trade, privateering raids against Spanish shipping and colonial outposts, and the first attempts at colonial settlement in Ireland and the Americas, established patterns of English maritime activity and imperial ambition that would intensify during subsequent centuries, and that would eventually create global networks of English-speaking populations descended from English settlers. The demographic impacts of these early imperial ventures remained modest during the Tudor period itself, with failed colonial experiments like the Roanoke settlement demonstrating the difficulties of establishing viable colonies, and with most English maritime activities involving relatively small numbers of sailors and merchants, rather than mass migration, though the commercial opportunities created by overseas trade attracted participants who developed specialized knowledge and skills, while the wealth generated through privateering and trade contributed to economic growth that would support larger populations and more extensive emigration in subsequent periods. The establishment of commercial companies, including the Muscovy Company, the Levant Company, and eventually the East India Company, created institutional frameworks for long-distance trade and laid foundations for commercial empire that would complement territorial conquest in creating British global power. The Stuart period, beginning with James I's accession in 1603, brought England into personal union with Scotland under a single monarchy, while maintaining separate kingdoms with distinct political and legal institutions, creating conditions that would eventually lead to full political union and that complicated English ethnic identity by establishing overlapping British and English identities whose relationship would remain ambiguous and contested. The political conflicts that characterized the Stuart period, including struggles between royal prerogative and parliamentary authority that escalated into civil war during the 1640s, reflected underlying tensions about governance, religion, and the distribution of power that engaged passionate commitments, and that would contribute to constitutional developments, establishing parliamentary supremacy and limited monarchy. The English Civil War that erupted in 1642 and continued through multiple phases until 1651, pitting royalist forces supporting Charles I against parliamentary armies, resulted in substantial casualties, including perhaps 100,000 battle deaths and even larger numbers of civilian deaths from disease and privation, representing approximately 3% of the total English population and marking one of the bloodiest conflicts in English history relative to population size. The execution of Charles I in 1649 an unprecedented act that challenged fundamental assumptions about monarchical authority and divine right, established the short-lived English Commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell's leadership, and demonstrated the willingness of parliamentary forces to pursue radical political solutions to constitutional conflicts. Though the restoration of the monarchy in 1660 under Charles II suggested the limits of English revolutionary sentiment and the persistent appeal of traditional monarchical institutions, the Restoration period witnessed rapid social and cultural change, including the reopening of theatres closed during the Commonwealth, the chartering of the Royal Society that would become a leading scientific institution, continued commercial expansion including the development of colonial holdings in North America and the Caribbean, and growing involvement in the transatlantic slave trade that would have profound moral and economic consequences while enriching English merchants and supporting colonial plantation economies. The Glorious Revolution of 1688. When James II was deposed and replaced by William of Orange and Mary in a relatively bloodless coup that established parliamentary supremacy and Protestant succession, created constitutional settlements that would govern English politics for centuries, and that would influence constitutional developments in other nations, including the United States, while the Bill of Rights of 1689 established fundamental principles protecting parliamentary authority and individual liberties that became central to English and British constitutional traditions. The development of England during the long 18th century, extending from the Glorious Revolution through the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, witnessed the rise of Britain as a global power through military victories, commercial expansion, imperial conquest, and naval supremacy, while domestic developments including agricultural improvements, proto-industrial manufacturing, and political evolution created conditions that would support the Industrial Revolution and demographic expansion. The Act of Union in 1707 that joined England and Scotland into the United Kingdom of Great Britain created new political structures while maintaining distinct Scottish legal and educational institutions, establishing frameworks for British identity that coexisted with continuing English, Scottish, and Welsh ethnic identities, and that raised questions about the relationships between these various forms of collective identification. The growth of London during this period into one of Europe's largest cities, exceeding 500,000 inhabitants by 1700 and approaching 1 million by 1800, created a metropolitan centre of commerce, culture, and politics that attracted migrants from throughout Britain and that developed cosmopolitan characteristics, distinguishing it from provincial English towns while serving as the economic and political heart of an expanding empire. The agricultural revolution of the 18th century, involving enclosure of common lands, adoption of improved farming techniques including crop rotation systems and selective breeding of livestock, and drainage of wetlands to create additional arable land, increased agricultural productivity and supported population growth, while transforming rural social relationships through the displacement of customary common rights and the creation of landless agricultural labourers dependent on wage employment. These agricultural changes contributed to population movements from rural areas to towns and cities, creating labour supplies for emerging industrial activities, while urban growth created markets for agricultural products and stimulated commercial farming oriented toward urban markets rather than subsistence production. The population of England, which had remained relatively stable during the late 17th and early 18th centuries at approximately 5 to 6 million, began sustained growth during the late 18th century that would accelerate dramatically during the 19th century, more than tripling to over 17 million by 1850, and reaching over 30 million by 1900, representing one of the most remarkable demographic expansions in European history and reflecting declining mortality rates, sustained high birth rates, and improving economic conditions that could support larger populations. The Industrial Revolution that began in Britain during the late 18th century, pioneering mechanized manufacturing, factory production, steam power, and coal-based energy systems that would transform global economy and society, created unprecedented economic growth while generating profound social dislocations, environmental degradation, and class conflicts that would characterize industrial society. The early phases of industrialization concentrated in textile manufacturing, with innovations including the spinning jenny, water frame, and power loom, enabling mechanized cloth production that displaced traditional hand spinning and weaving, while creating factory employment for workers, including women and children whose labor could tend machines and who would work long hours in often dangerous conditions for low wages. The development of steam power during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, based on improvements to steam engine design by James Watt and others, provided flexible power sources that could drive factory machinery and that enabled the expansion of coal mining to fuel industrial production, while steam-powered railways and ships would revolutionize transportation and communication. During the 19th century, the social consequences of industrialization transformed English society through urbanization that concentrated populations in industrial cities, proletarianization that created large working classes dependent on wage labor and separated from means of production, bourgeois class formation that created industrial and commercial middle classes whose wealth derived from business ownership and professional employment rather than land ownership, and social problems including urban poverty, disease, pollution, crime, and social unrest that would generate reform movements and ideological conflicts throughout the 19th century. The working and living conditions in industrial cities shocked contemporary observers and later historians, with dense crowding in unsanitary housing, inadequate water supplies and sewage systems, air pollution from industrial and domestic coal burning, and exploitation of labor, including children working long hours in mines and factories, creating conditions of immense human suffering that inspired reform movements, labor organization, socialist ideologies, and eventually government regulation of working conditions and public health measures. The response to these social problems proceeded gradually through the 19th century, with reform movements achieving legislation, limiting child labor, establishing public health regulations, expanding voting rights, and creating educational opportunities, while labor movements organized trade unions to bargain collectively for better wages and conditions, and socialist political movements developed ideologies critiquing capitalism and proposing alternative economic systems based on collective ownership and democratic control of production. The demographic characteristics of industrial English populations reflected the challenging conditions of 19th century urban life, with life expectancy in major industrial cities sometimes falling below 40 years due to infectious diseases spread through crowded, unsanitary conditions, while rural populations maintained somewhat better health outcomes, though still experiencing substantial mortality from tuberculosis, scarlet fever, and other endemic infections. The infant and child mortality rates remained extremely high throughout the 19th century, with perhaps 1/4 to 1/3 of children dying before age 5 in urban working-class districts, while maternal mortality from childbirth complications represented a major cause of death for women of childbearing age, creating demographic structures where families needed high birth rates to ensure survival of some children to adulthood, while the death of mothers in childbirth created numerous single-parent families and step-families through remarriage. The gradual improvements in public health during the late 19th century, including construction of water supply and sewage systems, regulation of food quality, provision of medical services, and eventual public health campaigns addressing infectious disease, contributed to declining mortality rates that would eventually transform demographic structures, while the demographic transition involving declining birth rates that began among middle classes during the late 19th century and spread to working classes during the 20th century would fundamentally alter English demographic patterns from high birth and death rates to low birth and death rates, characteristic of modern developed societies. The massive Irish immigration to England during and after the Great Famine of the 1840s represented the largest single immigrant influx in English history, bringing hundreds of thousands of Irish Catholics to English cities, where they concentrated in working-class districts, worked in manual labour, including construction and dock work, faced discrimination and prejudice from English Protestant populations, and gradually established Irish communities that maintained distinctive cultural and religious identities, while contributing Irish genetic ancestry to English populations, particularly in northwestern England and in London. The famine migration, driven by catastrophic potato crop failures that caused mass starvation and disease mortality in Ireland, and that resulted in total Irish population decline through death and emigration exceeding 2 million, brought desperate refugees to England, where they competed with English workers for employment and housing, generating nativist reactions that portrayed Irish immigrants as racially inferior, morally degraded, and threatening to English social order. The establishment of Irish communities in English cities created ethnic enclaves, where Irish cultural practices, Catholic religious observance, and Gaelic language maintenance occurred alongside gradual integration into English society through intermarriage, occupational mobility, and adoption of English language and customs by second and subsequent generations. Though Irish ethnic identity persisted and in some contexts strengthened through organisational activities, including Catholic parishes, Irish nationalist political movements, and cultural associations celebrating Irish heritage. The Victorian era under Queen Victoria's reign, from 1837 to 1901, overlapping substantially with the peak of British imperial power and industrial dominance, witnessed the consolidation of British control over vast territories, including India, substantial portions of Africa, colonies throughout the Caribbean and Pacific, and settler dominions in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, creating a global empire governing approximately 1/4 of the world's population and establishing English as a global language, while exposing English populations to diverse peoples and cultures through imperial administration, military service, missionary activity, and commercial enterprise. The ideology of empire, combining presumptions of racial and cultural superiority with senses of civilizing mission and religious duty to spread Christianity and British institutions, shaped Victorian English identity and justified imperial domination, while generating resistance movements among colonized peoples that would eventually dismantle European empires during the 20th century. The experience of empire affected English populations both through the opportunities provided for emigration to settler colonies, where English people established communities replicating or adapting English social patterns, and through the reverse impacts of imperial connections, including the arrival in England of colonial subjects pursuing education, employment, or political activities, creating small but visible populations of African, Asian, and Caribbean residents in Victorian English cities, particularly London, where imperial administration concentrated. The late Victorian and Edwardian periods, extending from approximately 1870 to the outbreak of World War I in 1914, witnessed continued industrial growth alongside emerging industrial competition from Germany and the United States that challenged British economic dominance, social reforms, addressing labour conditions, and expanding welfare provisions. Political developments, including continued expansion of voting rights, culminating in near-universal male suffrage, women's suffrage movements challenging political exclusion, and growing international tensions that would erupt into World War. The immigration during this period included Jewish refugees fleeing pogroms in the Russian Empire and persecution in Eastern Europe, with tens of thousands of Jewish immigrants settling in London's East End and other urban areas, where they established communities maintaining Jewish, religious, and cultural traditions while contributing to English commercial, intellectual life, and Italian immigrants working as labourers and establishing small businesses, particularly in catering and construction sectors. The responses to this immigration revealed persistent ethnic prejudices and anxieties about foreign influence, with the Aliens Act of 1905 representing the first significant restriction on immigration to Britain and reflecting political pressures to limit Jewish immigration, despite the relatively modest numbers involved compared to total English population. The catastrophe of World War I, which cost Britain nearly 900,000 military deaths and over 2 million wounded between 1914 and 1918, represented the bloodiest conflict in British history and devastated a generation of young men while transforming gender relations through women's participation in wartime production and contributing to social changes that would reshape English society during the interwar period. The demographic impacts extended beyond direct military casualties. to include the disruption of marriage and family formation as men served in military service, the gender imbalances created by male casualties that left substantial numbers of women unable to marry due to shortage of potential husbands, and the psychological trauma experienced by veterans whose war experiences marked them for life and whose injuries and disabilities required long-term care and support. The immediate post-war period witnessed political instability, economic difficulties, including high unemployment during the early 1920s, social tensions between classes as labor movements challenged existing hierarchies, and cultural changes, including the emergence of modernist, artistic, and literary movements, the spread of jazz music and American cultural influences, and changing social mores, particularly regarding women's roles and behaviors that reflected the social disruptions generated by wartime mobilization and post-war readjustment. The interwar period between 1918 and 1939 witnessed economic difficulties, including the Great Depression, beginning in 1929, that created mass unemployment and economic hardship, political polarization, with the rise of fascist movements on the right and communist movements on the left, challenging liberal democratic institutions, and growing international tensions as revisionist powers, including Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, challenged the post-World War I settlement and threatened renewed warfare. The immigration during this period remained relatively modest, with the most significant new population being Jewish, refugees fleeing Nazi persecution in Germany and occupied territories, with tens of thousands of Jewish refugees admitted to Britain during the 1930s, despite restrictive immigration policies and strong political pressures to limit refugee admissions, creating ethical dilemmas that engaged British public opinion and that would be judged harshly by later generations aware of the Holocaust that would claim millions of European Jewish lives. The period also witnessed the beginnings of political movements in British colonies demanding independence or greater autonomy, with Indian nationalism under figures, including Mohandas Gandhi, challenging British rule in India, and with independence movements emerging in other colonial territories, foreshadowing the decolonization that would dismantle the British Empire during the post-World War II period. The Second World War, from 1939 to 1945, represented another catastrophic conflict that cost Britain approximately 450,000 military and civilian deaths, subjected British cities to sustained aerial bombardment during the Blitz that killed over 40,000 civilians, and destroyed vast areas of urban housing and infrastructure, required total economic mobilization that transformed British society and economy, and ultimately contributed to Britain's victory as part of the Allied coalition, but left Britain economically exhausted and facing the loss of great power status. The wartime experience generated strong senses of national unity and collective purpose that would influence post-war political developments, including the creation of the welfare state and National Health Service. While the participation of colonial subjects in the British war effort, including hundreds of thousands of Indian soldiers and workers from Caribbean and African colonies, contributed to independence movements by demonstrating the contributions of colonial peoples and by exposing the contradictions of fighting for freedom while maintaining colonial rule over hundreds of millions of people. The immediate post-war period witnessed the election of a Labour government in 1945 that implemented socialist policies, including nationalisation of major industries, expansion of welfare provisions, and creation of the National Health Service, providing free healthcare, while beginning the process of decolonisation that would grant independence to India and Pakistan in 1947, and that would continue throughout subsequent decades as most of the British Empire was dismantled and replaced by independent nations. The immigration from former colonies and Commonwealth nations that began during the late 1940s and intensified during the 1950s and 60s represented a transformative demographic event that would fundamentally alter English ethnic composition and create the multi-ethnic society characteristic of contemporary England. The arrival of Caribbean migrants, beginning with the Empire Windrush in 1948, bringing nearly 500 West Indian passengers to England in a voyage that would become iconic of post-war Commonwealth immigration, initiated sustained migration from Caribbean islands, including Jamaica, Barbados, and Trinidad, where populations faced economic difficulties and limited opportunities, while British labour markets demanded workers for reconstruction, public services, and industrial production. The Caribbean migrants, predominantly of African descent, and bringing British colonial culture, including English language and Christian religion, that might have facilitated integration, nonetheless faced extensive racial prejudice, discrimination in housing and employment, and racist violence that revealed the persistence of racial hierarchies and the resistance of many English people to accepting non-white populations as fellow citizens, despite their Commonwealth status and British nationality. The South Asian migration, beginning during the 1950s and expanding dramatically during the 1960s and early 1970s, bringing populations from India, Pakistan, and subsequently Bangladesh to England, where they concentrated in industrial cities, including Birmingham, Bradford, Leicester, and London's East End, created substantial South Asian communities, maintaining distinctive religious traditions including Islam, Hinduism, and Sikhism, languages including Urdu, Punjabi, Bengali, and Gujarati, and cultural practices including arranged marriage and extended family households that differed from English norms and that generated both fascination and anxiety among English populations encountering these communities. The South Asian migrants arrived through various pathways, including labour recruitment for textile mills and other industries facing worker shortages, family reunification, as initial migrants brought spouses and children, and refugee movements, including Ugandan Asian refugees, expelled by Idi Amin in 1972, who came to Britain as British passport holders. Despite never having lived in Britain, the establishment of South Asian communities created visible transformations of English urban landscapes through the construction of mosques, temples, and gurdwaras serving religious needs, shops, and restaurants providing South Asian foods and products, and cultural institutions maintaining connections to homelands while facilitating community organization and mutual support among immigrant populations navigating unfamiliar English society. The political and social responses to Commonwealth immigration revealed deep tensions about English national identity, race, and the legacy of empire, with political movements, including Enoch Powell's inflammatory 1968 Rivers of Blood speech warning of racial conflict and calling for immigration restriction and repatriation, generating substantial political support, while also provoking counter-reactions, defending multicultural society, and condemning racism. The passage of Race Relations Acts during the 1960s and 70s attempted to address discrimination and racial violence, while Immigration Acts progressively restricted Commonwealth immigration, creating the contemporary framework where racial discrimination is legally prohibited, while immigration remains tightly controlled and politicized. The experiences of second and subsequent generations born in England to immigrant parents revealed the complexities of identity formation in multi-ethnic contexts, with individuals navigating between parental cultural heritage and English society, experiencing both discrimination based on racial or religious difference and gradual social integration through education, employment, and social relationships, and developing hybrid identities, combining elements from multiple cultural traditions. The late 20th century witnessed continued immigration from increasingly diverse sources, including refugees from Southeast Asian conflicts during the 1970s, Chinese immigration from Hong Kong, particularly before its transfer to Chinese sovereignty in 1997, continued South Asian and Caribbean migration through family reunification, and refugees from conflicts in Somalia, Iraq, Afghanistan, and the Balkans during the 1980s and 90s, creating urban populations of extraordinary diversity, particularly in London, where over 300 languages are spoken and where individuals of white British ancestry constitute less than half of the total population. In many boroughs, the transformation of English ethnic composition proceeded most rapidly in major cities, while rural areas and smaller towns remained more demographically stable, creating geographical patterns where urban areas experienced rapid diversification, while substantial rural regions maintained predominantly white British populations. generating political and cultural divisions between cosmopolitan urban areas, embracing diversity, and more traditional rural areas, uncomfortable with rapid demographic change. The economic restructuring associated with deindustrialization during the 1970s and 80s, as traditional manufacturing industries declined and service-based economy emerged, created new patterns of social inequality and regional disparities that intersected with ethnic divisions as minority populations concentrated in declining industrial cities facing economic challenges. The expansion of the European Union and the extension of free movement rights to citizens of new member states during the 2004 and 2007 enlargements brought substantial Eastern European immigration, particularly from Poland, Lithuania, and Romania, with hundreds of thousands of Eastern European migrants arriving in England to work in agriculture, construction, hospitality, and healthcare sectors, creating new patterns of European immigration that differed from earlier Commonwealth migration, in involving predominantly white Christian populations whose European origins might have suggested easier integration, but whose linguistic and cultural differences and their concentration in certain occupations and localities generated anxieties about cultural change and economic competition. The political responses to this immigration contributed to the rise of anti-immigration sentiment and Euroscepticism that would culminate in the 2016 Brexit referendum, where voters narrowly approved Britain's withdrawal from the European Union, with immigration concerns playing a central role in the Leave campaign and revealing deep divisions about national identity, sovereignty, and England's relationship to Europe. The genetic research on modern English populations conducted during the early 21st century, utilizing high-density genotyping and whole genome sequencing technologies, has provided unprecedented insight into the ancestry composition and population structure of contemporary English people, revealing the accumulated effects of millennia of migration, admixture, and demographic change, while also documenting substantial regional variation and the impacts of recent immigration on English genetic diversity. The studies analyzing the genetic ancestry of individuals who identify as white British and whose grandparents were all born in the United Kingdom, representing the population of predominantly native English ancestry, reveal that the largest ancestry component derives from Bronze Age populations who established themselves in Britain over 4,000 years ago and who contributed approximately 40 to 50% of ancestry to modern English populations, while Anglo-Saxon migrations contributed approximately 20 to 40%, Viking settlements contributed approximately 5 to 10%, and Norman conquest contributed approximately 5%, with the remainder deriving from various earlier and later population movements. The regional variation in these ancestry proportions demonstrates higher Anglo-Saxon ancestry in eastern and southeastern England, where Germanic settlement concentrated, higher Viking ancestry in northern England and East Anglia, where Scandinavian populations settled most densely, and higher pre-Anglo-Saxon ancestry in western England and Cornwall, where Celtic British populations may have maintained greater demographic continuity despite Anglo-Saxon political dominance. The genetic distinctiveness of English regional populations, while modest compared to differences between England and other European countries, demonstrates the persistent effects of historical settlement patterns and relative geographic isolation before modern transportation enabled extensive internal migration. The populations of Cornwall, showing elevated frequencies of ancestry components associated with pre-Anglo-Saxon British populations, maintain the strongest genetic connections to ancient Celtic populations, despite the extinction of Cornish language during the early modern period, while populations in northern England show intermediate characteristics between English and Scottish genetic profiles, reflecting the borderland location and complex history of population movements across the Anglo-Scottish, a frontier. The recent immigration from diverse global sources has created increasingly heterogeneous urban populations, particularly in London and other major cities, where individuals of non-European ancestry constitute substantial proportions of total populations, with genetic studies documenting representation of ancestry from South Asia, Africa, Caribbean, East Asia, Middle East, and essentially every region of the world, creating populations of extraordinary genetic diversity that contrast sharply with the more homogeneous populations in rural areas and smaller towns where recent immigration has had limited impact. The future trajectory of English ethnic composition and identity remains uncertain and will be shaped by immigration policies. Fertility differentials between populations of different ancestries, patterns of intermarriage between ethnic groups, and the evolution of social attitudes about ethnicity, nationality, and belonging in increasingly diverse society. The current demographic trends suggest continued diversification, particularly in urban areas, with minority populations growing as proportions of total population due both to continued immigration and to higher fertility rates among some immigrant origin populations compared to white British populations, while intermarriage between ethnic groups creates growing mixed ancestry populations whose identities may transcend traditional ethnic categories. The social and political implications of these demographic changes generate intense debate, with some emphasizing threats to traditional English culture and identity, while others celebrate diversity as enriching English society and reflecting England's historical tradition as a destination for migrants and refugees, revealing fundamentally different visions of English identity and its relationship to ethnic ancestry versus civic participation and cultural adoption. The scientific understanding of English ethnicity has been revolutionized through the integration of genetic analysis, archaeological investigation, historical research, and linguistic study, creating multidisciplinary syntheses that document the complex processes of migration, admixture, cultural transmission, and identity formation that have created contemporary English populations. The recognition that English ethnic identity cannot be reduced to simple genetic descent from a single ancestral population, but rather reflects contributions from multiple sources combined through historical processes, challenges essentialist notions of ethnicity, while also acknowledging that biological ancestry constitutes one component of ethnic identity, alongside cultural practices, linguistic heritage, historical consciousness, and self-identification. The debate about who should be considered ethnically English, whether based on ancestry, culture, self-identification, or some combination of factors, reflects broader tensions about national identity in multi-ethnic societies and the relationship between indigenous populations and immigrant communities, with no simple resolution apparent given the competing values of respecting historical continuity while embracing inclusive definitions that enable full participation by all residents regardless of ancestry. The contemporary English population of approximately 56 million people, distributed across a relatively small territory, creates high population density, particularly in southeastern England, where the London metropolitan region contains over 13 million people, while other regions, including the north, southwest, and rural areas, maintain lower densities, creating substantial regional variation in demographic characteristics, economic opportunities, and social environments. The age structure of the English population reflects the demographic transition to low birth and death rates, characteristic of developed societies, with growing elderly populations requiring healthcare and social support, while birth rates below replacement level raise questions about long-term population sustainability. Absent continued immigration, the health profile of modern English populations reflects both the benefits of advanced healthcare, nutrition, and sanitation that have eliminated or controlled many historical disease threats, while creating new health challenges, including obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and mental health conditions associated with modern lifestyles. With health outcomes varying substantially by social class and ethnicity, revealing persistent inequalities in health and healthcare access. The linguistic landscape of contemporary England remains dominated by English language, now established as a global lingua franca, spoken by over 1 billion people worldwide as either first or second language, while regional dialects maintain distinctive vocabularies, pronunciations, and grammatical features that reflect historical development and that serve as markers of regional identity. Though standardization through mass media and education has reduced dialectal diversity compared to earlier periods. The presence of substantial populations speaking languages, including Punjabi, Urdu, Bengali, Polish, and numerous others, creates multilingual communities, particularly in urban areas where language diversity reflects ethnic diversity, while concerns about linguistic integration and the acquisition of English language skills by immigrants generate debates about language policy, educational provision, and the balance between maintaining heritage languages and ensuring English language competence necessary for economic and social participation. The global spread of English through British colonialism and subsequently through American cultural and economic dominance has created a world where English serves as the primary language of international communication, science, business, and popular culture, establishing English as perhaps the most influential language in human history, while raising questions about linguistic imperialism and the fate of minority languages threatened by English linguistic hegemony. The cultural characteristics of contemporary English society reflect the accumulated influences of the multiple populations who have contributed to English ethnic formation, alongside the impacts of modernization, globalization, and technological change that have transformed social relationships, cultural practices, and daily life. The persistence of certain cultural patterns, including particular concepts of class distinction, reserve, and understatement in emotional expression, appreciation for gardens and countryside, enthusiasm for football and other sports, consumption of tea and particular food traditions, and attachment to constitutional monarchy, suggests cultural continuities despite demographic and social transformations, though the extent to which these patterns reflect intrinsic English characteristics versus constructed traditions that have been taught and reinforced through socialization remains debatable. The multicultural character of contemporary English society has introduced new cultural elements, including diverse cuisines, musical traditions, religious practices, and cultural celebrations that have been adopted by broader English populations beyond their communities of origin, creating hybrid cultural forms and demonstrating the capacity of English culture to absorb and adapt influences while raising questions about cultural appropriation and the relationships between cultural borrowing and cultural respect. The political debates about English identity and immigration that have intensified during the early 21st century reflect anxieties about rapid demographic change, economic insecurity, and perceived threats to traditional English culture and values, with populist movements emphasizing immigration control and cultural preservation gaining political support, while opposition movements defend multiculturalism and immigration as enriching English society and reflecting moral obligations, refugees and historical responsibilities stemming from colonial past. The Brexit referendum and its aftermath revealed deep divisions within English society about national identity, England's relationship to Europe, and competing visions of England's future, with voting patterns showing strong geographical and demographic divisions between urban areas, voting to remain in the European Union, and rural areas, and smaller towns voting to leave, suggesting fundamentally different experiences of contemporary social and economic change. The emergence of English nationalism as a political force, distinct from British nationalism, driven partly by devolution that created Scottish and Welsh political institutions, while England lacks comparable devolved government, raises questions about England's political status within the United Kingdom and about the relationships between English, British, and other forms of identity that coexist and compete in contemporary politics. The archaeological and historical investigation of English ethnic formation continues to generate new insights through ongoing excavations, analysis of documentary sources, and application of new analytical techniques, including isotope analysis that can determine geographical origins of individuals, DNA analysis of ancient populations, and computational analysis of historical texts, creating ever more detailed understanding of population movements, social structures, and cultural practices throughout English history. The ethical dimensions of this research include appropriate treatment of human remains, consultation with descendant communities, consideration of how research findings might be used or misused in contemporary political debates about immigration and identity, and responsibilities to communicate findings accurately while acknowledging uncertainties and avoiding oversimplifications that might distort complex historical realities. The public interest in ancestry and ethnic origins, reflected in the popularity of genetic ancestry testing services and historical documentaries about British history, demonstrates widespread curiosity about personal and collective origins, while raising concerns about how simplified or sensationalized presentations might create misleading impressions about the nature of ethnicity and the interpretation of genetic ancestry information. The synthesis of evidence from multiple disciplines creates robust understanding that English ethnicity represents the outcome of continuous processes of migration, admixture, and cultural transmission extending over 10,000 years of human occupation of Britain, with major transformative events, including Mesolithic colonization, following glacial retreat, Neolithic population replacement associated with arrival of farming, Bronze Age transformation through beaker migrations, Iron Age continuity and development of Celtic cultures, limited Roman demographic impact despite profound cultural influences, substantial Anglo-Saxon immigration and admixture, significant Viking contributions, particularly in northern and eastern regions, modest Norman genetic impact, despite dramatic cultural and political transformations, and diverse 20th and 21st century migrations, creating contemporary multi-ethnic society. The recognition that each of these episodes involved complex processes of population, movement, interaction between incoming and resident populations, genetic mixing, cultural transmission, and identity negotiation challenges simplistic narratives of ethnic origins, while demonstrating the remarkable capacity of human populations to absorb demographic and cultural changes, while maintaining senses of continuity and collective identity. The contemporary relevance of understanding English ethnic history extends beyond academic interest to engage with urgent questions about immigration policy, integration of ethnic minorities, the meaning of national identity in diverse societies, and the relationship between biological ancestry and cultural belonging. The historical perspective provided by investigation of English ethnic formation demonstrates that populations have always been mixed, that demographic change has been continuous throughout history, that ethnic identities are constructed through social processes rather than determined solely by biological descent, and that successful societies have negotiated population diversity through inclusive institutions and cultural practices that enable collective identification despite individual differences. The application of these historical lessons to contemporary challenges requires thoughtful consideration of both continuities and differences between historical contexts and present circumstances, avoiding both the romanticism that portrays past diversity as unproblematic and the pessimism that portrays contemporary diversity as unprecedented threat, while developing policies and practices that acknowledge the legitimate interests of both established populations and newcomers in creating just and cohesive societies. The future evolution of English ethnicity will depend on demographic trends including immigration levels, fertility patterns, and intermarriage rates that will determine the genetic composition of future English populations, alongside social and political developments that will shape how ethnicity is conceptualized and how diverse populations negotiate shared identity and collective belonging. The technological and scientific developments that have revolutionized understanding of population history through ancient DNA analysis, isotope studies, computational analysis, and other innovative methods will continue generating new insights while raising new questions about interpretation and application of findings, while ethical frameworks for conducting and communicating research will need to address concerns about privacy, consent, potential misuse of findings, and responsibilities to affected communities. The globalization and technological change that are transforming human societies worldwide create contexts where national and ethnic boundaries become simultaneously more porous through international migration and communication, and more emphasized through political movements, asserting cultural distinctiveness and national sovereignty, generating tensions that shape debates about identity throughout the contemporary world. The story of English ethnicity ultimately illustrates fundamental aspects of human nature, including the capacity for both cooperation and conflict, the tension between maintaining tradition and adapting to change, the construction of collective identities that create senses of belonging while potentially excluding others, and the remarkable creativity humans display in generating cultural traditions and social institutions. The specific trajectory of English ethnic formation, while unique in its details, reflects general patterns of population movement, mixing, and identity formation that characterize human history globally, demonstrating both human diversity and underlying commonalities that transcend particular ethnic identities. The contemporary challenges facing England and other diverse societies in negotiating relationships between populations of different ancestries, reconciling competing claims about belonging and rights, and constructing inclusive societies that respect both continuity with past traditions and adaptation to present realities, engage fundamental questions about justice, belonging, and human dignity that have no simple answers, but that require ongoing dialogue, negotiation, and commitment to shared values. The genetic evidence, archaeological findings, historical documentation, and linguistic analysis that collectively document English ethnic history provide resources for understanding present circumstances and for imaging possible futures, while the recognition of complexity and contingency in historical processes should inspire humility about claims to definitive knowledge and openness to revising understanding as new evidence emerges. The English population of the present moment represents a snapshot in continuous processes of demographic and cultural change that will continue into the future, creating populations that will be simultaneously recognizably English through cultural continuities and linguistic heritage, while potentially differing genetically and culturally from present populations through ongoing immigration, intermarriage, and cultural evolution. The capacity to maintain collective identity while accommodating change represents one of the remarkable features of human societies, enabling groups to persist across generations despite continuous turnover of individual members and gradual transformation of cultural practices and population composition. The responsibility of scholars investigating ethnic history includes not only producing accurate knowledge through rigorous research methods, but also communicating findings in ways that promote understanding, while avoiding oversimplification or distortion, engaging with ethical implications of research, and considering how findings might influence public discourse and policy debates. The challenge of public communication about ethnicity and population history requires balancing scientific accuracy with accessibility, acknowledging uncertainties while providing useful insights, and resisting both misuse of findings to support prejudiced ideologies and the temptation to suppress or distort findings deemed politically inconvenient. The ultimate goal of research on English ethnic history should be to enhance understanding of human diversity and shared humanity, to provide historical perspective on contemporary challenges, to demonstrate the complexity of ethnic identity and the limitations of simplistic ethnic nationalism, and to contribute to creating societies where individuals from diverse backgrounds can participate fully in collective life while maintaining meaningful connections to their particular heritages.